Super Mario 64 is full of different enemies. We got Bob-ombs, we got Koopas, we have a chain jump, but perhaps the most iconic enemy is the Goomba. It's the first enemy you see in the game, and it's a pretty easy encounter. You just attack him and he dies. But despite how simple Goombas seem, they actually have a ton of glitches, which is what we're here to talk about today. This is every Goomba glitch in Super Mario 64. But before we get into Goomba glitches, we should probably discuss how Goombas work in general. So, Goombas by default will just walk around. That might not seem like much, but it's way more advanced than many other enemies. For example, Bob-ombs just walk in circles. Spindrifts walk in circles. Bullies walk in circles. Scuttlebugs walk in circles. But for Goombas, he ain't walking in no circle. So how does his movement work? Well, here's the simplest way to think about it. The Goomba makes what I'm going to call the movement decision. That's the main decision that the Goomba makes over and over throughout its walking. Now, the movement decision has 4 different choices the Goomba can make, and which choice it makes is dependent on RNG, or random number generation. Then after it completes its choice, it makes the movement decision again, and that just repeats for forever. So going back to the Goomba, let's see what these 4 choices are. There's a 3/8 chance that the Goomba turns to the left and walks forwards. How long it walks forwards for depends on RNG, and will be a value between 100 and 200 frames, or about 3 to 7 seconds. There's also a 3/8 chance that the Goomba turns to the right and walks forwards for that same random amount. So that's why you'll see Goombas turn slightly and then continue walking. But the Goomba can also do something that's a little more rare, and that's jumping. See, there's a 1/8 chance that the Goomba jumps while doing a big turn to the left. And similarly, there's a 1/8 chance that the Goomba jumps while doing a big turn to the right. So those are the 4 choices a Goomba can make when it does a movement decision. Walk left, walk right, jump left, jump right. And as soon as it finishes doing that choice, it makes the movement decision again. So it'll either walk forwards and then make another choice, or jump and then make another choice. So now, let's watch the Goomba as it makes these choices in real time. So first the Goomba turns to the left and walks for a bit, and then the Goomba jumps left and walks right. Now it is possible for the Goomba to do multiple jumps in a row, so watch closely. The Goomba jumps left, jumps right, walks right. So between each walking segment, there can be any number of jumps, including doing 0 jumps as we see here. So it just went from walking to walking, which causes it to do a slight turn. So yeah, I think you get the idea. Now one cool thing you can do is manipulate RNG to get the Goomba to do an infinite number of jumps. Like, there's normally only a 1/4 chance that he jumps, but we can make dust on certain frames to manipulate RNG to hit that chance over and over, and make the Goomba jump as long as we want. Man, look at him go, he's getting a real workout over there. Now, there's one important property that every Goomba has, which is its home. The home is a point in 3D space, specifically the point where the Goomba originally spawned. Now, the home plays an important role in the Goomba's behavior, because the Goomba isn't allowed to walk more than 1,000 units away from its home. We'll call this spherical area the Goomba's home range. So if a Goomba does happen to walk outside of its home range, then it's programmed to walk back towards its home until it's back inside the home range. That's why when we look at the Goomba's pathing over time, we see that it never walks too far away from its home, because the second it goes outside of its home range, it's forced to go back. Now so far, we've just been talking about regular sized Goombas, but Goombas actually come in 3 different sizes: medium, tiny, and huge. The 3 sizes behave mostly the same, but they do differ in some key properties, so let's compare them. First, let's talk about regular Goombas. If you come into contact with a regular Goomba, you'll receive 1 damage. If you punch a regular Goomba, he'll move horizontally until he hits the ground and dies. But if we breakdance into a Goomba, he'll move more vertically and die in midair. So there's actually 2 different ways to give a Goomba knockback. One where he moves horizontally until he hits something and dies, and one where he moves vertically and dies in midair. And finally, if we bounce on a Goomba from above, he'll get squished and die. And note that a regular Goomba will always produce 1 yellow coin when he dies. Next, let's talk about tiny Goombas. If you come into contact with a tiny Goomba, you'll receive knockback but no damage, and the Goomba dies in the process without producing a coin. Then like before, we can punch a tiny Goomba to kill him horizontally, where he falls with very low gravity. We can breakdance into a tiny Goomba to kill him vertically. And we can bounce on a tiny Goomba from above, in which case he gets squished and dies. So tiny Goombas do produce a yellow coin so long as you kill them with an attack, instead of just letting them walk into you. But unfortunately, sometimes when you try to jump onto a tiny Goomba, you don't end up bouncing on it. Instead, you just land on the ground and then the Goomba hits you, resulting in no coin. So why does that happen? Well, let's play it again, pause it, look at it from the side, and hide the background. Here's Mario's hitbox, and here's the Goomba's hitbox. The hitboxes are cylinders, so they just look like rectangles from this side view. Now Mario will bounce on the Goomba if the following conditions are met. Their hitboxes overlap while Mario's in the air, moving down, and Mario's above the Goomba. Now let's focus on that first condition, requiring the hitboxes to overlap. But if we step through the frames, we see that Mario goes straight from his hitbox being above the Goomba's hitbox to Mario landing on the ground. And now that he's landed, he can't bounce on the Goomba anymore because he has to be in the air for that. But instead he's on the ground, so he gets hit by the Goomba. So yeah, jumping onto tiny Goombas is risky because you might end up with bad spacing that skips straight over the Goomba's hitbox instead of intersecting it. And finally, let's talk about huge Goombas. If you come into contact with a huge Goomba, you'll receive 2 damage. Now, regular attacks like punching and breakdancing don't actually kill the huge Goomba. Instead, it just makes him bounce up. And you can hit the Goomba on multiple consecutive frames, causing him to go really high up. And note that each frame that you're hitting him produces its own set of yellow particles, so we can make a lot of particles just from one attack, since it hits him so many times in a row. But huge Goombas aren't invincible. See, jumping onto them will still kill them and produce a yellow coin. But interestingly, if you kill a huge Goomba by ground pounding him, it'll actually produce a blue coin, which is worth 5 yellow coins. And the same thing happens if you twirl off of a fly guy and attack the Goomba using the twirl. That also produces a blue coin. So getting the blue coin out of them is definitely useful if you're going for the 100 coin star. So to summarize, Goombas come in 3 sizes: medium, tiny, and huge. But interestingly, we can subdivide them even further into 2 different classes of Goomba. One class is singleton Goombas, and the other class is Goombas belonging to a triplet of Goombas. So let me explain the differences. Let's say we have a singleton Goomba. A singleton Goomba will exist no matter where Mario goes in the level. So even if Mario goes really far away, the Goomba is still loaded in memory. But note that all Goombas have a draw distance, which is a sphere around the Goomba. If Mario exits the draw distance, the Goomba becomes inactive, meaning it turns invisible and won't move around anymore. But it's still loaded in memory. And then if Mario goes back into the draw distance, the Goomba becomes active again, meaning it turns visible and will move around more. So in the game, we have this Goomba, and his draw distance looks like this. So, if we exit the draw distance, then the Goomba becomes inactive. And if we go into the draw distance, then the Goomba becomes active again. And we can even oscillate in and out of the Goomba's draw distance every other frame to make the Goomba flicker. Now let's talk about Goomba triplets. The way they work is that there's an invisible object called a Goomba spawner. The spawner has an inner radius and an outer radius. When Mario goes into the inner radius, the spawner spawns the 3 Goombas. And when Mario goes outside the outer radius, the spawner despawns the 3 Goombas, meaning the Goombas don't exist at all. See, not even a dashed outline this time. So in the game, here's a Goomba spawner. Stepping back a bit, here's the spawner's inner radius and here's its outer radius. So you can see that when Mario enters the inner radius, the Goombas load, and when Mario exits the outer radius, the Goombas unload. And note that since the loading and unloading use 2 different radius sizes, we can't do the oscillating technique from before to load and unload the Goombas every other frame. So at first glance, the 2 classes of Goombas seem pretty similar. You can see the Goombas when you go close to them, but not when you go far away. But internally, they're using 2 completely different systems. The singleton Goomba is switching between being active and inactive, but it exists in memory the whole time. It's always loaded. But for the Goombas of a Goomba triplet, they switch between being loaded and unloaded. So when they're unloaded, they don't exist at all. And then when you go close again, the Goombas are recreated on the spot. Now remember how I said singleton Goombas have a draw distance? Well, each Goomba in a triplet also has a draw distance that affects its activeness, and those are completely separate from the Goomba spawners loading and unloading radius sizes. So if you go too far away from a Goomba, the Goomba becomes inactive. And if you go too far away from the Goomba spawner, then all 3 Goombas unload. Now, if you kill a Goomba belonging to a triplet, the Goomba spawner keeps track of that. And so then if you go far away and come back, the Goomba spawner knows to only load the Goombas you haven't killed yet. So that creates the illusion that it's the same Goombas each time. But like I said, the Goomba spawner is just constructing new Goombas each time in the spots you haven't killed yet. Also, note that each Goomba in a triplet has its own home where it initially spawned. So if we look at the paths of these Goombas over time, we see that they each stay within their respective home range. But of course, there's a lot of overlap in the middle where they all have access to and can walk into each other. So in summary, there are 6 types of Goombas, 3 different sizes, and 2 different classes. In total in the game, there are 23 medium singleton Goombas, 10 tiny singleton Goombas, 8 huge singleton Goombas, 11 medium Goomba spawners equaling 33 Goombas, 0 tiny Goomba spawners equaling 0 Goombas, and 1 huge Goomba spawner equaling 3 Goombas. And so all in all, that's 77 unique Goombas in the game. However, it's not always obvious whether a Goomba is a singleton Goomba or belongs to a triplet, so let's look at some examples. These 3 Goombas in Tall Tall Mountain belong to a triplet. These 3 huge Goombas in Tiny Huge Island belong to a triplet. In fact, they're the only triplet of huge Goombas in the game. These 3 Goombas in Shifting Sands Land are actually not part of a triplet, they're just 3 singleton Goombas. Same thing for these 3 Goombas in Bowser in the Dark World, they're also all singleton. This Goomba in Rainbow Ride is a singleton Goomba. These 2 Goombas in Bowser in the Sky are both singleton Goombas. And these 2 Goombas in Bowser in the Sky actually belong to a triplet. But if they belong to a triplet, then where's the 3rd Goomba? Well, here's the Goomba spawner. When you go close to it, it spawns Goombas here, here, and here. But as you can see, that 3rd Goomba spawns off the edge, and Goombas are programmed to snap down to the floor right when they spawn. So since that Goomba's off the edge, he snaps all the way down to the death barrier, and he's visible there for 1 frame right when he spawns. But then on the next frame, he becomes inactive and disappears, since, you know, you're so far away from him. Using some clever camera positioning, it is possible to catch a glimpse of the Goomba on that 1 frame before he disappears. Playing it again, we can see him appear right there. But no one's ever killed that Goomba or collected his coin, and so he's become known as the Mystery Goomba, or Impossible Goomba. Like, there's just no way to kill him or even get over to him when he's stranded all the way down here on the bottom of the course. Let me show you with the side view. So here's Mario, and here's the Mystery Goomba. Now if Mario's within this blue sphere, the Goombas, including the Mystery Goomba, will be loaded. But Mario has to go within this red sphere for the Mystery Goomba to become active. But as you can see, the 2 spheres don't overlap. And so if you jump down to get over to the Mystery Goomba, he unloads before he ever becomes active again. So we can't even reactivate him, much less get over to him to kill him. And so as far as we know, there's just no way to defeat that Goomba. Now something else interesting is that in the Goomba spawner's code, it can actually spawn a variable number of Goombas. Like, it's not just hard-coded to do 3 every time. Instead, there's a property on the Goomba spawner object that in theory could be set to a higher number to spawn more Goombas. In the game though, they never actually use that functionality, they just always go with the default of 3. But if we use hacks to modify that number, we can see what 4 Goombas would have looked like. And here's what 5 Goombas would have looked like. And here's what 16 Goombas would have looked like. So by hacking that number, we can see this unused functionality to spawn more Goombas in the circle. And you know how the Goomba spawner keeps track of which Goombas have died so that it knows not to respawn them? Well, that functionality only works for the first 6 Goombas that spawn, because I guess the developers never got around to fine-tuning this functionality. So here with 16 Goombas, if we kill them all, then leave and come back, only the first 6 stay dead, while the other 10 respawn anyway. So yeah, it seems like the developers were thinking of having more Goombas spawn from a spawner, but didn't actually go through with it or finish programming it. Now, as I mentioned before, Goombas will turn around once they walk outside of their home range. So you might think a Goomba's forever stuck inside its home range. But us glitch hunters, we found ways to make Goombas go beyond that. For example, remember how with a huge Goomba, you can punch it and it won't die? Well, every punch causes the Goomba to turn towards Mario and walk that way for a bit, even if that means walking away from its home while it's outside of its home range. So by repeatedly attacking a huge Goomba, we can actually transport him very far away from his home. I can even knock him down onto the beach. I bet you never saw a Goomba down here before. And using the shell makes it even easier, because then Mario's whole hitbox counts as an attack on the Goomba. So for this Goomba, we can transport him and bring him all the way over to the cannon, and then we can knock him inside the cannon. but unfortunately he just dies in there because it's filled with water, and Goombas can't exactly survive in water. More on that later. Then for this Goomba, we can transport him and bring him over to Wiggler's hole on top of the mountain. And of course, then we can knock him into there, causing him to get stuck down there and walk in circles for forever. I don't think he'll be getting out of there anytime soon. But hey, at least Wiggler has a friend now. And we can also put a huge Goomba on top of an item block. Look, his shadow can't even fit all the way onto it. And then if you open the item block, the Goomba just falls down. He doesn't die like you might have expected from some other Mario games. You can also put a Goomba into a warp pipe, though this one works a little differently. See, the warp pipe is an object, and objects are only tangible when Mario's within a certain radius around them. Here, Mario's standing outside of that radius, so the warp pipe is currently intangible. So that allows the Goomba to walk into the warp pipe, and then we can have Mario go closer to make the warp pipe tangible again, effectively trapping the huge Goomba inside. Look, his model barely fits in there. He can still get me, but I can get him too. Take that! So yeah, you thought you needed a Pokeball to capture creatures? Nope, just use a warp pipe. Then using that same principle, we can also put a Goomba on top of a sign. See, we let the Goomba walk into the sign when the sign is intangible, and then we have Mario go close to the sign to make it become tangible right at the peak of the Goomba's jump. And so the Goomba snaps onto the top of the sign. Man, look at him go. He's trying real hard to get off of there. But nope, he'll be stuck there for all eternity. You know, unless I walk away and make the sign become intangible again. And here's something cool. You see that Goomba in the fence over there? Well, what if we brought more Goombas into the fence? For example, this Goomba over here. I can transport him all around and then have him go into the fence. But how many more can we get? Well, there's this Goomba up here. I can transport him over and get him into the fence. Then there's this Goomba over here. I can transport him all the way over and get him inside. Then there's this Goomba on the cliffside. I can transport him over to be with the rest of them. And finally, there's this Goomba near the cannon. I can transport him over to have all the Goombas be in the fence together. And you know what that means? We've created the Goomba Jamboree. I know, we all wanted the Scuttlebug Jamboree, but you know, you have to take what you can get. And in this case, we have 6 Goombas all in the fence together. Now it's not actually all the Goombas in the level. See, there's these 2 Goombas near the warp pipe that I didn't bring over, because there's just no good path from here to the fence. And then there's these 3 Goombas at the start which belong to a Goomba spawner. They don't work because the spawner's radius doesn't enclose the fence, so Mario couldn't escort the Goombas over there without them unloading. But for these 6 Goombas, we finally got them all together for one big jamboree. We did it, guys. The true goal of Super Mario 64 has been achieved. And I'll also show what this looks like from a top-down view. This white circle is Mario, each of these colored circles is one of the Goombas, and this gray outline is the fence, which already contains the red Goomba. So first I brought the orange Goomba over, then I brought the yellow Goomba over, then I brought the green Goomba over, then I brought the blue Goomba over, and then I brought the purple Goomba over. So yeah, that's how I got all the Goombas into the fence, or at least all the Goombas you can get. Now with regular Goombas, we obviously can't do that same trick to move them with the shell, because a single attack will kill these Goombas. But there is a slight variation we can do, where instead of punching the Goomba over and over, we bump into the Goomba over and over. Like before, this causes the Goomba to turn towards Mario and walk that way for a bit, even if that means walking away from its home. But the problem is that each hit causes Mario to lose 1 health, so we can only bump into a Goomba 7 times before we have to stop and get more health. But if you go get health and then come back, the Goomba will have already walked back into its home range, resetting all your progress. So it's a pretty limited technique. But this technique was actually used in an alternative strat in the A button challenge. You know, where your goal is to not press the A button. Specifically, it was used for collecting the stars Scale the Mountain in 0 A presses. See, we can lure a Goomba up to the top of the mountain near the star, but it's still not close enough to the star for us to use, and it won't voluntarily walk any closer. But we can bump into it a few times to lure it a bit closer and then bounce on it to reach the star. Now if there's a Bob-omb present, we can do something even cooler to move Goombas around. See, we can pick up the Bob-omb and then use it to push Goombas around. But why does that work? Well, to understand this, we have to talk about how holding objects works. See, holding objects in Super Mario 64 is basically an illusion, because when you pick up an object, the real object just turns invisible, and the game renders a graphic of the object in Mario's hands. Then when you release the object, the game stops rendering the graphic in Mario's hands, and the real object turns visible and teleports over the Mario. So this process gives the illusion that you're holding the object even though you're just holding a graphic of it while the real object is elsewhere and invisible. So for a Bob-omb, if Mario picks it up, the real Bob-omb turns invisible and the game renders a graphic of the Bob-omb in Mario's hands. And then when you release it, the game stops rendering the graphic and the real Bob-omb turns visible again. But interestingly, when the Bob-omb is invisible, it doesn't just stay where it was like the box did. Instead, it hovers in front of Mario. The programmers did that because the smoke comes out of the real Bob-omb and not the graphic. And so they needed the real Bob-omb to stay somewhat near the graphic so that it still looks right. But strangely, even though the Bob-omb is invisible while you're holding it, it's actually still tangible, which is why it can push Goombas. So we can pick up a Bob-omb so that the real Bob-omb hovers invisibly in front of Mario while still being tangible, and then use that Bob-omb's hitbox to push the Goombas around. But unfortunately, this trick only lasts for a little bit until the Bob-omb explodes. But luckily, there's a way to extend it. See, here's what we can do. Grab a Bob-omb, then jump into a wall in a certain way so that we hold the Bob-omb hands-free. Now Mario's in a broken state where he can do stuff like teleport even though the Bob-omb still thinks it's being held. And now after teleporting, Mario's free from having to hold the Bob-omb, but the Bob-omb is still in the state of being held. And now we go back to where we left the Bob-omb at the other teleporter and it reactivates and clings to Mario. Because remember, a Bob-omb that's being held continuously updates to be right in front of Mario, and it's invisible but still tangible. And also, it'll never explode now. So basically, this technique gives us free reign to push Goombas wherever we want with no time pressure. For example, we can push a Goomba into a cannon. I can push a Goomba through a wall, and when I do this, you might wonder what happens to him. Well, here's another view of it. You can see that the Goomba falls down until it deactivates from Mario being outside of its draw distance. I can push a Goomba off the edge of the course. I can push a Goomba straight through the floor. I can bring a Goomba over to Chain Chomp, but they just go through each other. I guess the programmers never expected that interaction. I can push a Goomba behind Chain Chomp's gate, but he's able to walk out of there because the gate is just a one-way wall. I can even bring a Goomba to the King Bob-omb fight. Come on Goomba, let's fight him tag team style. I'll go first, so you stay over here. Okay. Oh, he got me! Goomba, save me! Oh, phew, thanks for cushioning my fall, Goomba. Your sacrifice won't be forgotten. Then in Shifting Sandland, we can have a Goomba go into the hole on a Tox box. And then here, oh no, Goomba, watch out! No, the Goomba! Just kidding, he's fine. Goombas can only get squished by Mario, not level geometry. We can also push a Goomba all the way up the pyramid and into the hole on top. So I guess iRock has a friend now too. And in Rainbow Ride, this technique was actually used in the A button challenge for the star swinging in the breeze. See, the star is too high up to reach without the A button, but luckily, there just so happens to be a Goomba nearby, and I knew a way to bring that Goomba all the way over to the star. How'd I do it, you ask? It was the hands-free teleported Bob-omb. Come on, use some context clues. But yeah, I had to bring the Goomba up the ramp and then across the swing. And the swing was pretty tricky because you have to go fast, but I figured it out. And now you can see how high up the star is. So I put the Goomba near the star, got rid of the Bob-omb, and then used the Goomba to bounce up into the star. So yeah, that's how this star was first collected without using the A button. Now, one caveat of this technique is that only singleton Goombas can be transported all around the course. See, if we try to do it with a Goomba from a triplet, the Goomba unloads once we go too far away from the Goomba spawner. So for example, in the A button challenge, there's this star from the chests. This star is too high up to reach with a rollout. Consequently, over the years, many people have suggested trying to move a Goomba over to the star. But these Goombas are part of a triplet, so even if we did have the ability to transport a Goomba, done here with a hacked-in Bob-omb, the Goomba would just unload once we move too far away from the Goomba spawner. So it's just not possible for Mario to bring a Goomba all the way over to the star. Now, let's take a Goomba and look at it from above. There are two important angles that the Goomba keeps track of. First, its facing angle. I'll represent this with a yellow arrow. And second, its target angle. I'll represent this with a green arrow. Now let's let the Goomba walk around and observe. So the yellow arrow is the direction that the Goomba is currently facing and moving, and the green arrow is the direction that the Goomba wants to move. So the yellow arrow will turn towards the green arrow. And so you can see that each time the Goomba makes its movement decision, the green arrow updates instantly, and then the yellow arrow turns towards the green arrow until they're aligned. Now, there are 5 different situations that set the Goomba's target angle. First, if the Goomba's moving around inside of its home range, then it updates its target angle on each movement decision. So for the Goomba, it could walk left, walk right, jump left, or jump right, and that'll update the target angle. Second, the Goomba walks outside of its home range. So here, if the Goomba goes outside of its home range, then the target angle will be set back towards its home. That way, the Goomba goes back into its home range. Third, the Goomba touches Mario. See, if they come into contact with each other, the Goomba sets its target angle towards Mario, which is why it then turns towards Mario as it jumps up. Fourth, the Goomba notices Mario. See, if Mario goes close to the Goomba notices Mario and sets its target angle towards him. And so that's what causes the Goomba to go after Mario. And then fifth, the Goomba walks into something. It could be the Goomba walking into a wall, it could be the Goomba walking into an edge, or it could be the Goomba walking into an object like another Goomba. Then its target angle will be a reflection away from that thing in order to make the Goomba turn around and move away from that thing. Now I'll show what each of these situations looks like in the game. So first, when the Goomba makes its movement decision. This is what we saw earlier. So whenever the Goomba makes a movement decision, its target angle updates instantly and then its facing angle turns towards that new target angle. Second, when the Goomba goes outside of its home range. So here, you can see that once the Goomba walks outside of its home range, its target angle is set back towards its home, causing the Goomba to turn around and go back into its home range. Third, when the Goomba touches Mario. So here, you can see that once Mario touches the Goomba targets Mario and jumps up while turning towards him. So this is the functionality I used earlier when I repeatedly bumped into the Goomba to move him away from his home range. And it's also the functionality I used when I transported a huge Goomba away from his home by repeatedly punching him. Then fourth, when the Goomba notices Mario. See, in order for the Goomba to notice Mario, 3 conditions have to be met. First, the Goomba has to be within its home range. Second, Mario has to be within the Goomba's home range. And third, Mario has to be within 500 units of the Goomba, which we'll call the notice range. And so when Mario goes close to the Goomba will notice him. So to summarize, for the Goomba to notice Mario, both the Goomba and Mario have to be within the Goomba's home range, and Mario has to be within the Goomba's notice range. And note that for this visual, I'm making the ranges circles on the ground instead of spheres, because that'll be easier to see. So now, let's watch as I interact with the Goomba. So watch, I get the Goomba to notice me, causing him to jump and then chase after me. And the chase will last until one of the 3 conditions fails. And now, I lure the Goomba outside of its home range, causing it to stop chasing me and instead just walk back towards its home. But the moment it comes back inside, it starts chasing me again. Next, you can see that the moment Mario steps outside of the home range, that also ends the chase. See, he won't notice me if I stand over here. Now exiting the notice range will also end the chase, and we can oscillate in and out of the notice range to have him notice me many times. And similarly, we can oscillate in and out of the home range. See, even though I'm standing right next to the Goomba, he only notices me the moment I step inside the home range. And now watch this. If we stand in just the right spot, we can have the Goomba chase Mario forever. Like, he just runs in a big circle around Mario, never going close enough to hit Mario, but also never going far away enough to make Mario exit the notice range. Fast forward 10 minutes and Mario fell asleep, but the Goomba's still going. Now as we just saw, Goombas will jump when they notice Mario. Nothing weird there, but now watch this. If the Goomba's above Mario, like upwards on a hill or on a higher platform, then it's possible that the Goomba will jump multiple times when it notices you. See, it just jumped 3 times and then it jumped 2 times. So what's going on there? Well, let's play it again, pause it, and look at it from the side. Now I said the Goomba notices Mario when Mario goes within a certain radius around the Goomba, but we can just as easily think about it as the Goomba entering a certain radius around Mario. Now let's zoom in extra on the Goomba to see what happens when it enters the radius. Now it's okay if the jump itself exits the radius because the Goomba is in the jumping action during that, but as soon as the Goomba lands and does a little bounce, then it goes back into the walking action, at which point it does matter if it exits the radius. And as you can see, because the little bounce exits the radius and then re-enters, it causes the Goomba to notice Mario again. And this is only possible because the edge of the radius is sloped at this point due to the Goomba being above Mario. I'll show what I mean with a diagram. Now the Goomba's little bounce goes up and forwards, so if the Goomba enters the radius at the same height as Mario, the bounce arrow stays within the radius. If the Goomba enters the radius below Mario, the bounce arrow still stays within the radius. But if the Goomba enters the radius above Mario, then the bounce arrow goes outside of the radius, leading to more jumps. And this effect is amplified the higher up on the circle you go. So here, the Goomba's about to enter the radius right above Mario. So let's see how many jumps it'll do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. That's a lot of times to notice someone who's not even moving. And then fifth, when the Goomba walks into something, its angle gets reflected away from that thing. Now there are 3 broad categories of things that cause reflections. First, the Goomba walks into a wall. So this could be the Goomba walking into an actual wall, but it could also be the Goomba walking into a steep floor, which isn't technically a wall, but it is treated exactly how a wall is treated. Then second, the Goomba walks into an edge. This could be an edge next to out of bounds, meaning there's no floor beyond the edge. It could be an edge with a big drop down to the next floor, or it could be an edge next to a floor that slopes down very steeply. And then third, the Goomba walks into another object. But only certain objects work for this, which includes walking into another Goomba, walking into a Koopa, and walking into a Spiny. So in all of these cases, the Goomba's angle gets reflected, causing the Goomba to turn away from the thing that it walked into. However, the specifics of the reflection depend on which of the 3 cases we're in. So let's go through the 3 cases, starting with walking into walls, or steep floors. So here's a wall as seen from above, and here's a Goomba who's facing northeast. So the Goomba walks northeast into the wall and then it does a reflection. Specifically, its facing angle reflects over the angle of the wall, so it reflects like this. And that reflected facing angle becomes the new target angle. So the Goomba would then turn around to face that new target angle. Now I should mention, when the Goomba does a reflection, it enters a special mode, which we'll call turning around mode. I'll represent that a Goomba is in turning around mode by making the arrow outlines red. Now when a Goomba is in turning around mode, it doesn't care about staying inside its home range, it doesn't care about noticing Mario, and it doesn't care about walking around randomly. Instead, all it cares about is turning towards its target angle. Once it finishes doing that and the arrows align, turning around mode ends and the Goomba behaves normally again. So basically, if the arrow outlines are red, the yellow arrow will turn towards the green arrow and no other behavior happens until that's done. So let's see what this looks like in the game. The Goomba walks to the right and then hits a wall. So we take the angle of the wall and reflect the facing angle over that line. Then that arrow becomes the new target angle. And since a reflection just happened, the Goomba goes into turning around mode with the red outlines on the arrows. So now the Goomba turns away from the wall until its facing angle meets the target angle, and then it's done with turning around mode. And then it just moves around normally. So yeah, that's what a typical wall reflection looks like. The Goomba walks into the wall and then turns away from the wall. Now remember, this applies to steep floors too, even though they're not actually walls. So here, the Goomba walks onto the steep floor of the rock. So we take the angle of the steep floor, reflect the facing angle over that line, and that arrow becomes the new target angle. And the Goomba goes into turning around mode. So now the Goomba turns away from the steep floor until its facing angle meets the target angle, and then it's done with turning around mode and moves around normally. And you can see that the Goomba actually goes onto the steep floor while he's turning away from it. Now here I've moved a Goomba very far away from his home using a hands-free teleported Bob-omb. Like, his home is on the other side of this wall. So now if we let him try to walk back towards his home, he walks into the wall, turns away from it, walks into the wall, turns away from it, and that just repeats. So now if we fast forward, we see that he ends up moving along the wall until his home is directly on the other side of the wall. And then he just sort of hangs out in that spot because he can't get any closer to his home. Now since Goombas turn away from walls, we can use that to do something cool. See, we can lure the Goomba into the wall in just the right way, causing it to walk very far away from its home. What's going on is, the Goomba turns counterclockwise in order to go back towards its home, but then it hits the wall and turns clockwise away from that wall. And that just repeats over and over, meaning the Goomba keeps oscillating between turning clockwise and counterclockwise, ultimately causing it to walk in a straight line away from its home. And this only works because the turning around mode overrides the Goomba's urge to go back towards its home, like I mentioned earlier. Now eventually, the Goomba reaches the end of the wall and then manages to turn around. And interestingly, interestingly, it does the same thing on the way back. It turns towards its home into the wall, then turns away from the wall, and that just repeats. And so after some time, the Goomba manages to get all the way back into its home range. We can also do this with a huge Goomba. So I lure him into the steep floor at just the right angle, and then he gets stuck oscillating. He turns left to go back towards his home, but then turns right to turn away from the steep floor. However, using a steep floor isn't as stable as using a wall, so eventually the Goomba breaks free and turns around. And then he does a similar thing on the way back. And we can also do this with a tiny Goomba. So I get his attention and then lure him all the way over here to this wall. Then I get him to go outside of his home range, and before you know it, he starts oscillating against the wall. Now since he's tiny, he doesn't move as fast as the other Goombas, but you know, he's still getting there. Fast forwarding a bit and he's made it all the way over here. But then something a little strange happens. He just stops moving. Look, he's completely still. Now based on the arrows, we can see that he's still oscillating, but he's not actually moving anywhere. So what causes the Goomba to get stuck like this? Well, it has to do with the way Goombas interact with walls. See, the Goomba's behavior on every frame goes like this. First, handle wall interactions, and second, move one frame forwards. So let's watch this play out. First, handle any walls. The Goomba's currently not in any walls, so that step does nothing. And then the Goomba moves one frame forwards, which looks like this. Next frame, the Goomba handles any walls, but he's not in any walls. Then the Goomba moves one frame forwards, which looks like this. Now, even though the Goomba's currently inside the wall hitbox, it's not until the next frame that does something. So now on this frame, the Goomba handles any walls, which means it gets pushed out by the wall, and then it moves one frame forwards, once again ending the frame inside the wall hitbox. And continuing forward, those two steps would just keep happening. Now here's the code that Goombas use for wall interactions, but there's something interesting about the coordinates that it uses. See, here are the Goomba's coordinates, which are floats, but the code first converts those coordinates into shorts, and then that's the position that it uses to check for walls. Let's look at an example. So for the Goomba itself, the type of its coordinates are floats, meaning they can have decimal components. So the Goomba might be at x coordinate 1.43 and z coordinate -2.89. But that's not where the game would check for walls. Instead, there's a slightly different point where the game checks for walls whose coordinates are shorts, meaning they have no decimal components. So to calculate these coordinates, you can take the Goomba's coordinates and chop off the decimal components. So it's not rounding, it's truncating. And so even though the Goomba is at 1.43 -2.89, the game would check for walls at 1 -2. So let's go back to the visual we had before, but now let's add unit grid lines. Also, here's the x-axis and here's the z-axis, so that we know where the origin is. Now I should clarify, wall hitboxes for Goombas are actually 40 units in radius, but that's a little too big to show here, so we're just gonna pretend that wall hitboxes are 2 units in radius to make things easier to see. So now let's watch the Goomba move. First it checks for wall collision, not at the Goomba's position, but at the Goomba's position truncated to integer coordinates, which will always be the corner of the Goomba's unit square closest to the origin. There's no wall there, so we're done handling walls. Then the Goomba does its movement, which looks like this. So far so good. Now next frame, the game checks for walls at the corner closest to the origin, still no walls. Then the Goomba moves and gets closer to the wall. Next frame, the game checks for walls at the corner closest to the origin. This time there is a wall there, just barely. Now because the wall detection point is on the very edge of the wall hitbox, it pushes the Goomba out a distance of 0, but that still counts. So the Goomba ends up flush with the wall hitbox. So in general, if the Goomba's anywhere in this unit row next to the wall, it gets sucked into the wall during the wall collision step. Anyway, then the Goomba does its movement, which looks like this. Next frame, the game checks for walls at the corner closest to the origin. There is a wall there, so it pushes the Goomba out to be flush with the wall hitbox, and then the Goomba does its movement, which looks like this. So as you can see, the truncation done for wall detection does alter the Goomba's pathing by a bit. Specifically, each frame, the truncation moves the Goomba a fraction of a unit towards the origin. Here, since the Goomba's trying to walk away from the origin, the truncation towards the origin ends up slowing the Goomba down. On the other hand, if the Goomba's heading towards the origin, then each truncation moves it a fraction of a unit towards where it's going, and so it speeds up the Goomba's movement. We can see this difference in speed using that Goomba from before. On the left side, the Goomba's moving towards the origin, so it moves slightly faster, and on the right side, the Goomba's moving away from the origin, so it moves slightly slower. Looking at the bottom screens, you can see that the left side is moving faster than the right side. Now remember, that row of units below the wall will suck the Goomba back into the wall, but for most Goombas, they are able to escape from the wall because their movement can skip straight over that row of units, and so the Goomba can escape the wall. That's why normally Goombas don't get stuck on walls, they're able to get out of the wall hitbox. However, all of that analysis was for regular sized Goombas who move at a couple units per frame. So if the truncation causes their movement to be off by a fraction of a unit each frame, it's not that big a deal. But for tiny Goombas, they move so slowly that their movement only covers a fraction of a unit per frame. So if the truncation causes their movement to be off by a fraction of a unit each frame, then it actually is a big deal. So let's go through the visual again, but this time the Goomba will be moving less than 1 unit per frame in order to mimic the tiny Goomba. So first handle walls at the corner, but there are none. Then move forwards. Then handle walls at the corner, but there are none. Then move forwards. Then handle walls at the corner, and this time there is a wall there. So the Goomba gets put on the edge of the wall hitbox, and then the Goomba moves forwards. But now watch what happens. We handle walls at the corner, which pushes the Goomba to the bottom of the wall hitbox. Then the Goomba moves forwards, and now the Goomba's right back to where it was at the start of the frame, meaning it made no progress. So as you can see, the Goomba ends up stuck in place, because each frame, the truncation cancels out the small bit of movement forwards that it does. So looking at the Goomba, it moves a little to the right, then gets truncated to the left, then moves a little to the right, then gets truncated to the left, and so on. So the truncation is no longer just a slight change, but now it affects the whole movement because of how slow moving tiny Goombas are. But that's just when the Goomba moves in the direction away from the origin. If instead the Goomba heads towards the origin, then it actually is able to move at a rate of exactly 1 unit per frame. In other words, it can move along the wall at a speed slightly faster than its normal walking speed, because this time the truncation is working in its favor. Now if the Goomba tries to walk away from the wall, moving away from the origin, then it also gets stuck in place, because the truncation keeps putting it back against the wall. It's like I was saying earlier, that row of units south of the wall sucks the Goomba in, and the Goomba doesn't move far enough each frame to cross over those units. So basically, the Goomba's stuck against the wall, and then if the Goomba tries to walk away from the wall moving towards the origin, then it still can't escape the wall, but it does manage to move 1 unit to the side each frame. So let me summarize all of that. If the tiny Goomba moves into the wall moving away from the origin, it just gets stuck. If it moves away from the wall moving away from the origin, it also gets stuck. If it moves into the wall moving towards the origin, then it moves 1 unit along the wall each frame. And if it moves away from the wall moving towards the origin, then it also moves 1 unit along the wall each frame. So those are the 4 cases for this setup. So let me show what this looks like in the game. Here's a tiny Goomba who's right next to a wall, though you probably never noticed the weird wall shenanigans because this area is so small that the Goomba usually notices Mario and then you just kill him. So here the Goomba walks into the wall and then tries turning away from it, but as we just discussed, that doesn't work. Instead, the Goomba gets stuck against the wall and can't escape. So if the Goomba walks to the right, then he just stays motionless, and if he walks to the left, then he's able to move along the wall. And note that that little hole in the wall is purely graphical, so there's still wall collision there. So is there anything the Goomba can do to escape the wall? Well, as we just saw, jumping doesn't work. But if Mario goes close to the Goomba and gets the Goomba to chase him, then the Goomba is able to escape. And that's because the Goomba's chasing speed is more than 1 unit per frame, allowing the Goomba to cross over that row of units next to the wall that suck him in. However, one important caveat here is that all this analysis was done with the origin behind the wall. If instead the origin is in front of the wall, then it's a little different. Because now if a Goomba is in that row of units next to the wall, the truncation doesn't pull the Goomba into the wall. Instead, the truncation goes away from the wall, which lets the Goomba safely escape from the wall hitbox. So for this setup, moving into the wall away from the origin results in getting stuck. Moving into the wall towards the origin results in moving 1 unit per frame along the wall. Those are the same as last time, but now moving away from the wall away from the origin lets the Goomba escape, and moving away from the wall towards the origin also lets the Goomba escape. So basically, if the origin is in front of the wall, the tiny Goomba can escape the wall and there's no risk of getting stuck on it. So let me show what this looks like using that wall on the edge of the course next to Out of Bounds. The Goomba walks into the wall and gets stuck in place as it's walking into the wall, but once it turns around, it's able to escape and leave the wall hitbox. So yeah, now you understand why the Goomba stopped moving earlier. He was allowed to move forwards before he crossed the axis line because then he was moving towards the origin. But the moment he crosses the axis line, then he's trying to move away from the origin and just gets stuck in place. And one other thing, Goombas will only reflect off of walls if they walk into the wall from the front, which is the intended way to walk into a wall. So if a Goomba walks into a wall from the back, like here with Chain Chomp's gate, the Goomba doesn't reflect at all. Finally, we're done with walls. Now we can move on to edges, the second thing that causes reflections. So here's a floor rectangle as seen from above, and here's a Goomba who's facing northeast. So the Goomba walks northeast into the edge and then it does a reflection. Now you might think it would get reflected over the angle of the edge, but that's not what happens. Instead, the arrow reflects over itself. In other words, the facing angle does a complete 180 and that becomes the new target angle. So the Goomba would then turn around to face that new target angle. And you can see that the Goomba doesn't walk off the edge, but instead its movement just gets cancelled if it would have gone off the edge. Now since the Goomba had to turn 180 degrees, you might wonder whether it would turn clockwise or counterclockwise. Like, the Goomba usually just turns whichever way is shorter, but this is a rare case where turning clockwise and counterclockwise are actually tied. But the answer is simple, it'll always turn clockwise, or to the right. Why does that happen? Well, let me explain. Firstly, angles in Super Mario 64 are measured in angle units. The way angle units work is that a full 360 degrees is 65,536 angle units, which means that half a circle is 32,768 angle units. Now counterclockwise is the positive direction, and clockwise is the negative direction. So that's the basics of angle units. But now, let's think about a Goomba. So the Goomba has a facing angle and a target angle. Now the game determines which way the Goomba turns using the following method. It calculates the angle difference between the facing angle and the target angle. If the difference is positive, the Goomba turns counterclockwise, and if the difference is negative, the Goomba turns clockwise. Right now, the difference between the angles is 0 because the arrows are aligned. But let's say the target angle was to the northwest. Now the difference between the arrows is 8,192 angle units. That's a positive number, so the Goomba would turn counterclockwise to reach it. If the target angle was to the west, then that's a difference of 16,384, so the Goomba would still turn counterclockwise to reach it. And if the target angle was to the southwest, then that's a difference of 24,576, so the Goomba would also turn counterclockwise to reach it. On the other hand, if the target angle were to the northeast, then that's a difference of negative 8,192, so the Goomba would turn clockwise to reach it. If the target angle was to the east, then that's a difference of negative 16,384, so the Goomba would still turn clockwise to reach it. And if the target angle was to the southeast, then that's a difference of negative 24,576, so the Goomba would also turn clockwise to reach it. But what happens in this bottom area where the left side and right side converge? Well, for the left side, we know for sure that up until this angle, 32,767, it's still positive, so the Goomba would turn counterclockwise to reach it. And for the right side, we know for sure that up until this angle, negative 32,767, it's still negative, so the Goomba would turn clockwise to reach it. But we're still missing exactly one angle, which is when the target angle is exactly 180 degrees away from the facing angle. So what's the angle difference here? If the difference were labeled positive 32,768, then it'd be claimed by the left side and the Goomba would turn counterclockwise to reach it. However, if the difference were labeled negative 32,768, then it'd be claimed by the right side and the Goomba would turn clockwise to reach it. So which is it, positive or negative? Well, the thing is, the angle difference is measured with a short, and shorts can only have integer values between negative 32,768 and positive 32,767. So based on that range, a short can have a value of negative 32,768, but cannot have a value of positive 32,768. So in our diagram, this final angle has a value of negative 32,768, simply due to the properties of shorts. And so it's claimed by the right side, meaning the Goomba will always turn clockwise or to the right when turning 180 degrees. So that's why whenever a Goomba walks into an edge and has to turn 180 degrees, it always turns to the right. Similarly, if it walks outside of its home range exactly straight and has to turn 180 degrees, it'll also turn to the right. And if Mario goes directly behind a Goomba down to the exact precision, the Goomba turns around to the right. But anyway, now let's analyze the Goomba walking into an edge more closely. The Goomba walks to the left and then hits the edge. So we reflect the facing angle over itself, and then that arrow becomes the new target angle. And since a reflection happened, the Goomba goes into turning around mode. So now the Goomba turns clockwise 180 degrees away from the edge until its facing angle meets the target angle, and then it's done with turning around mode and moves around normally. So yeah, even though it looks like turning to the left would have been simpler, the Goomba always has to turn to the right. Now here's a situation where I moved a Goomba very far away from his home. See, his home is on the other side of this edge. So now if we let the Goomba walk back towards his home, we see that he walks into the edge, then turns around, then walks into the edge, then turns around, etc. And in this case, he has a slight drift to the side, so over a long time, he ends up moving along the edge. Then here, I have a Goomba walk into the edge, and then I deactivate him. Now interestingly, the flag that keeps track of whether a Goomba is walking into an edge doesn't reset properly when the Goomba is deactivated. So currently, that flag is staying on, causing the Goomba to think it's perpetually walking into an edge, and so he just keeps turning around forever. And so now, if I strategically reactivate him just when he's walking to the right and then back into the edge, I can have him move along the edge very slowly. So by repeatedly doing this for 5 minutes, I can move him very far away from his home. And he's also very far away from the Goomba spawner. So now if Mario goes over there, he exits the Goomba spawner radius, causing the Goomba to unload. And watch this. If a Goomba starts chasing you in a narrow spot, he may end up getting stuck chasing you for forever. Like, he hits this edge, wants to turn around, hits that edge, wants to turn around, and repeats that over and over for forever. And so he'll never get out. We can also put a Goomba onto this steep pillar in Shifting Sands Land. This pillar is so steep that the Goomba can't walk uphill or downhill on it, and he reflects in both directions for different reasons. Like, when the Goomba tries to walk uphill, he does a wall reflection, so the target angle is the reflection over the angle of the wall. And when the Goomba tries to walk downhill, he does an edge reflection, so the target angle is the reflection 180 degrees around. So the Goomba is just stuck in a perpetual state of reflecting over and over without actually going anywhere. And finally third, if a Goomba walks into an object like another Goomba, then that causes a reflection. Though this one gets a bit complicated. See, here's the code that handles objects colliding. It's almost perfect except for this line. This line calls the inverse tangent function using the x and z distances between the Goombas, and so that function should produce the angle from one Goomba to the other. But the problem is that the inputs into the function are in the wrong order. It's supposed to go z component then x component, but for whatever reason, they put x component then z component. That results in the wrong angle between the Goombas, so the reflection over that angle is kind of wonky. Like, it doesn't make sense in terms of the geometry. It's not intuitive at all. Let me show you. Well, first we're going to analyze what the function was intended to do, you know, without the mistake. So here's Goomba A and here's Goomba B, but instead of labeling them with big letters, I'm just going to color Goomba B gray, which will help avoid clutter later. Now we're going to analyze how Goomba A reacts when it walks into Goomba B. Now even though the two Goombas just collided, it still looks like there's some space between them, but that's just how it works in the game. See, even when Goombas are colliding, they're still separated a bit graphically, and that's because Goombas collide when their hitboxes touch. Their hitboxes are cylinders, so they just look like circles when viewed from above like this. So now let's talk about the reflection, which will set Goomba A's new target angle. See, there are two relevant angles that go into calculating the new target angle. First, Goomba A's facing angle, and second, the angle from Goomba A to Goomba B, which I'll represent with a brown arrow. The brown arrow is what's affected by the bug in the code, but remember, for now we're analyzing it as if the code were correct. So yeah, those are the two arrows relevant for calculating Goomba A's new target angle. Note that Goomba B's facing angle doesn't actually play a role in the calculation, so he can be facing whatever direction and it doesn't matter. So the way the new target angle is calculated is as follows. Take the line perpendicular to the brown arrow, reflect the yellow arrow over that line, and that becomes the new target angle. So the Goomba goes into turning around mode and then turns away from Goomba B. That makes sense, right? Just think of them like billiard balls. Goomba A was going northeast, hit something to the north, and then bounces off going southeast. Now let's look at another collision where the Goombas walk into each other like this. This time, Goomba A is facing southwest and the angle to the other Goomba is to the north. The critical difference this time is that Goomba B is now behind Goomba A, not in front. So if we follow the instructions from before, we draw this line perpendicular to the brown arrow, reflect a yellow arrow over that line, and that becomes the new target angle. But you see, this reflection would actually cause Goomba A to turn towards Goomba B, whereas the whole point of the turning around behavior is to turn away from things. That's why in this situation, when a Goomba walks into a Goomba behind himself, the reflection doesn't actually happen. In other words, Goomba A will only reflect off of Goomba B if Goomba A is facing Goomba B during the collision. More specifically, the angular distance between the yellow arrow and the brown arrow has to be less than 90 degrees. If that condition is met, then the reflection happens. But if Goomba A is facing away from Goomba B, then the reflection doesn't happen. To illustrate this, I'll draw a translucent green arrow, meaning no reflection happens, but that's where it would be if we did the math anyway. Now if we rotate Goomba A's facing angle, we can see how the reflection works at various other angles. The green arrow is always the reflection of the yellow arrow over the purple line, and this reflection only occurs when the green arrow is opaque, which is just when Goomba A is facing Goomba B. Similarly, we can rotate Goomba B around Goomba A to see how that affects things. When Goomba B is directly in front of Goomba A, the target angle is straight backwards. When Goomba B is to the side of Goomba A, the target angle is just a slight turn to the other side. And when Goomba B is behind Goomba A, no reflection happens. Now remember, all of that analysis was for how reflections off other Goombas was meant to work. In other words, that was the easy setup where reflections made sense and were intuitive. But like I said, there's a bug in how they call the inverse tangent function. So, let's say Goomba B is here. Now we're going to analyze the distance between Goomba A and Goomba B. Specifically, the x component and z component of the distance. Now in case you don't know, the x-axis goes east and west, with east being the positive direction and west being the negative direction. And the z-axis goes north and south, with south being the positive direction and north being the negative direction. So now consider the distance from Goomba A to Goomba B. Along the x-axis, we have this big x component, and along the z-axis, we have this small z component. We can add these two vectors together to reach Goomba B, which means that this is the angle to Goomba B, this hypotenuse of the triangle. But remember, that's the true angle to Goomba B without the bug. Whereas in reality, there's the bug that switches the x and z components. So instead of a big x component and a small z component, the game switches them and instead thinks there's a big z component and a small x component. When we add these two vectors together, it results in this angle. So this is the bugged angle to Goomba B that the game uses. And you can see that it doesn't actually point at Goomba B, it's just somewhere else in space. Now since the brown arrow is the result of switching the x and z components, the simplest way to think about it is as follows. Take this diagonal line that separates the x and z axes, like the x and z axes are mirrored over that line, then the brown arrow will just be the true direction to Goomba B reflected over that diagonal line. So occasionally, the brown arrow will correctly point at Goomba B, but most of the time it's just in some other direction that has no meaning. Now let's say the Goombas collided like this. So what would the reflection look like? Well, we just go through the same steps as before, but now with the bugged brown arrow. So here's Goomba A's facing angle, then we take the line perpendicular to the brown arrow, reflect the facing angle over that line, and that becomes the new target angle. But that's just how the math works out. In reality, this reflection wouldn't actually happen because the yellow arrow is more than 90 degrees away from the bugged brown arrow. So the game doesn't think Goomba A is facing Goomba B, even though we can clearly see that he is. On the other hand, let's say the Goombas collided like this. So here's Goomba A's facing angle, then we take the line perpendicular to the brown arrow, reflect the facing angle over that line, and that becomes the new target angle. And this time the reflection would happen because the yellow arrow is within 90 degrees of the brown arrow. So the game thinks Goomba A is facing Goomba B, even though we can clearly see that he's not. Now if we rotate Goomba A's facing angle, we can see how the reflection works at various other angles. It's not very intuitive how it works because of the bug in the code. But remember, it's not random, it's just hard to mentally grasp. And similarly, we can rotate Goomba B around Goomba A to see how that affects things. It's very hard to understand, but if you were to pause it and then follow the math, you'd find that it works out. So let's look at this in the game. Here are two Goombas, and they walk into each other on this frame. So for the Goomba on the right, here's his true angle to the other Goomba, but that gets reflected over this orange line, resulting in this angle. Then we take the line perpendicular to the brown arrow, reflect the yellow arrow over that line, and that becomes the new green arrow. And of course, the Goomba goes into turning around mode. So that's what's going on with this Goomba, and now let's look at the other Goomba. So here's the true angle to the first Goomba, but that gets reflected over this orange line, resulting in this angle. Then we take the line perpendicular to the brown arrow, reflect the yellow arrow over that line, and that becomes the new green arrow. And again, the Goomba goes into turning around mode. So that's what this Goomba does. And now if we resume, you can see that both Goombas turn towards their target angles, and then they're done with turning around mode and move normally. So yeah, even though they're using the wrong angles to each other, they can still both do reflections. On the other hand, the Goombas might walk into each other like this. So for the Goomba on the right, here's his true angle to the other Goomba, but that gets reflected over the orange line, resulting in this angle. But this time, there's more than 90 degrees between the brown arrow and the yellow arrow, so the reflection doesn't happen. In other words, this Goomba thinks the other Goomba is behind him even though he's clearly in front. So that's what's going on with this Goomba, and now let's look at the other Goomba. So here's the true angle to the first Goomba, but that gets reflected over the orange line, resulting in this angle. But once again, there's more than 90 degrees between the brown arrow and the yellow arrow, so this reflection doesn't happen either. And so what ends up happening is that the Goombas walk into each other with no one turning around. There's no reflections. So yeah, this time no one turns around despite that they're colliding. Now, an interesting thing about turning around mode is that the Goomba maintains its current speed until turning around mode is done. So if a Goomba walks into a wall at its normal walking speed, it'll turn around at that normal speed. But if a Goomba moves into a wall while it's running, it'll turn around while running the whole time. We call this technique a chase extension because the Goomba was chasing Mario at a fast speed, then hits a wall and goes into turning around mode, which redirects and extends the chase. And it's all done at that fast speed. Now remember, a Goomba in turning around mode must finish turning towards its target angle before resuming its normal behavior, even if that means going outside of its home range. So here, you can see the Goomba turn around and walk slightly outside of its home range, but only a little bit. But if we do it again, this time with the Goomba running, now it goes really far outside of its home range, because the whole turning around mode was done while running, which obviously goes a lot farther than walking speed. This technique was even used in the A button challenge in Jolly Roger Bay for the 100 coin star. See, we do a chase extension on two of these Goombas using the rock and wall, and then the second Goomba actually does another chase extension off of the first Goomba, causing it to go really far away from its home. And we needed it to go that far so that we can bounce on it and ground pound the blue coin block without having to press A. And remember earlier when I made a Goomba run back and forth for forever on this narrow bridge? Well, that was the result of a chase extension, because here, the Goomba's chase keeps getting extended over and over for forever. Now, there's a theoretical technique to chain together multiple Goomba chase extensions. See, the idea would be to have two Goombas continually reflect off of each other in a pattern. Like, as one Goomba turns clockwise, the other Goomba turns counterclockwise, so that they meet up and can reflect off of each other again, and so on. If we draw the paths of the Goombas, we see that it looks sort of like a double helix, like DNA. Now, I don't think this technique has an official name, so I'm just gonna call it the double helix chase extension. Here's what that looks like in the game, or at least my best attempt at doing it. Unfortunately, I was only able to get 2 loops before it stopped working. But that's not my fault, because there's actually an inherent flaw in this plan. Let's step through it more closely. So here, 2 Goombas walk into each other, the top Goomba's going to the right and the bottom Goomba's going to the left. Now let's analyze the reflections. For the top Goomba, here's the true brown arrow, which gets reflected over this orange line so that it goes to the right. Then here's the line perpendicular to the brown arrow, so the yellow arrow gets reflected over the purple line and that becomes the new green arrow, and the Goomba goes into turning around mode. Then for the bottom Goomba, here's the true brown arrow, which gets reflected over this orange line so that it goes to the left. Then here's the line perpendicular to the brown arrow, so the yellow arrow gets reflected over the purple line and that becomes the new green arrow, and the Goomba goes into turning around mode. So that's how the reflections work for this collision. Then the Goombas do their loops and meet up again. But this time, something's a little different. Instead of the Goomba directions being right-left, this time they go left-right. That might not seem like a meaningful difference, but let's do the analysis. For the top Goomba, here's the true brown arrow, which gets reflected over this orange line so that it goes to the right. But this time, the yellow arrow and brown arrow are separated by more than 90 degrees, so no reflection happens. And for the bottom Goomba, here's the true brown arrow, which gets reflected over this orange line so that it goes to the left. And now once again, the yellow arrow and brown arrow are separated by more than 90 degrees, so no reflection happens here either. So even though the double helix seemed good on the surface, the sad truth is, only half of the reflections work, while the other half don't work. Now since the working ones and not working ones alternate, it seems like the most loops you could do in a row would be one, and then the next one wouldn't work. But during my attempt in the game, I actually got 2 loops by being a little sneaky. See, the Goomba who was behind on the first interaction actually goes to the front for the second interaction, which switches things up. So first we had a right-left, then another right-left, but then we had a left-right, which doesn't work. So is it possible to do more than 2 loops? I'm not sure, but this was the most I was able to pull off. Separately, it's possible to have 2 Goombas run into each other and just get stuck there in a sort of equilibrium. Like, if the Goomba code wasn't bugged, 2 Goombas who run into each other head-on would both turn around and do a 180. But because of the bug, both Goombas are able to walk into each other without feeling the need to turn around. It's also possible for 2 Goombas to walk into each other without them chasing Mario, where they also get stuck in an equilibrium. This phenomenon doesn't have an official name yet, so I'm gonna call it a Goomba Gridlock. So look, the Goombas are just walking into each other, holding each other in place, and they don't even care about Mario, they're only focused on each other. So why does this happen? Well, let me show you. First, let's look at the Goomba on the left. He's facing this way, and here's the angle to the other Goomba. So we take this orange line and reflect the brown arrow over it. Now the angle between the yellow arrow and brown arrow is less than 90 degrees, just barely, so the Goomba does a reflection. So take the purple line, reflect the yellow arrow over it, and that becomes the green arrow. And the Goomba goes into turning around mode. And so now, the Goomba turns counterclockwise towards that target angle, completing turning around mode. Then on the next frame, here's the angle to the other Goomba, so we take the orange line and reflect the brown arrow over it, but this time, the angle between the yellow arrow and brown arrow is slightly more than 90 degrees due to the Goomba's little turn from earlier, so we don't get another reflection. So what does the Goomba do instead? Well, zooming out, here's the Goomba's home and his home range. You can see that the Goomba is slightly outside of his home range, meaning he now targets his home. And so that causes him to turn 1 frame clockwise, effectively undoing the other little turn and putting the Goomba back to how he was originally. And now this process just keeps repeating. He reflects off the other Goomba, turns counterclockwise, targets his home, turns clockwise, and that just keeps happening, which is what causes the Goomba to be stuck in an equilibrium. And the same thing applies to the other Goomba. Going through the same process, we see that this Goomba gets reflected to this target angle, and so he turns counterclockwise to reach it. And now the Goomba doesn't reflect because the angle difference is more than 90 degrees, and this Goomba is also outside of his home range. So he targets his home and then turns clockwise towards that target angle. And now that just repeats over and over, causing this Goomba to also be in an equilibrium. So the result is that both Goombas are forever stuck in this configuration. And interestingly, a Goomba Gridlock can have a slight drift over time. So if we wait for 30 minutes, we see that the Goombas drift to the side, potentially going very far outside of their home range. But there's actually a much more efficient technique to move Goombas far away from their home, still using an equilibrium against another Goomba. See, we have Goomba A walk into Goomba B in just the right way so that, like before, he repeatedly oscillates between turning away from the other Goomba and turning back towards his home. And this allows him to walk away from his home while outside of his home range. We call this technique a Goomba Escort because it's like Goomba B is escorting Goomba A outside of where he's supposed to be. And actually, it's even possible to get both Goombas to escort each other in what we call a double Goomba Escort. With this technique, they can both go outside of their home ranges and travel really far away. So let me fast forward a bit, and now the Goombas have walked all the way over here, somewhat near the chests. So can we use this to help with the A button challenge? No, because if you were paying attention earlier, you'd remember that the Goombas walk outside of the Goomba spawner radius, meaning that Mario can't even reach the Goombas over here because they'll just unload. And a Goomba Escort is even used in the A button challenge in Tiny Huge Island as the fastest way to get to the mainland without pressing A. So first I use a butterfly bomb to push this tiny Goomba off, which lets me bounce on him to reach the next platform. And from here, I can get close enough to a Goomba on the mainland to reactivate him so that he starts walking around. You can see him on the right 2 screens, and he's about to go on quite the journey. Fast forwarding a bit, and the Goombas walked all the way down here so that he's closer to Mario. Then I get him to walk into the wall and get stuck there. You know, because tiny Goombas can get stuck against walls, like we talked about. But he's not as far to the right as I would like him to be. And he won't voluntarily walk anymore in that direction because he's on the very edge of his home range. But luckily, there's another tiny Goomba nearby who can assist with this. So I have that second tiny Goomba go to the left of the main Goomba and then push the main Goomba farther to the right. That gets him closer to being in the right position to start the Goomba Escort. But he's still not all the way there, so we actually have to get the other Goomba to push the main Goomba multiple times until he's finally in the right spot. And then we initiate the Goomba Escort, causing both Goombas to walk southeast. Now remember, the whole point of all this is to get Mario up to the mainland of the course, because right now he's stuck on those platforms down below in the water. Those 2 Goombas are the key to getting up there, and that tiny Koopa is gonna help too. So watch this next part closely. Those 2 Goombas fall down, allowing Mario to bounce on them in midair, get onto the item block, and then get onto the mainland. Here it is again. It's quite an amazing feat, bouncing on falling Goombas at just the right times in order to gain height and get up there. But wait, how did the Goombas fall down? Don't Goombas usually turn around when they encounter an edge? Well, that is what they normally do, but there are a few ways around it. For example, one Goomba can push another Goomba off an edge. If a Goomba jumps right before it reaches an edge, that can cause it to go over. Let's play it again. See, the jump itself goes straight up, and so that doesn't fall off. But after the jump, it does a few little bounces while moving forward. And so if it bounces over the edge instead of walking into the edge on the ground, then it'll go over the edge. So in the Tiny Huge Island strat, I got the Goomba on the left to jump right before the edge so that he bounces over, and the Goomba on the right was pushed off by the tiny Koopa, and I had to get them to fall on just the right frames to make the timings work for the bounces up. And there are a few more strats in the A button challenge that also make use of Goombas falling down. Also in Tiny Huge Island, we can get a tiny Goomba to jump right before the edge so that he falls down and we can bounce on him to reach the piranha plants. This was actually part of the original strat to get to the mainland, but that strat's very slow overall, and so it's been outdated by that other strat we saw. In Bowser in the Dark World, we can get this Goomba to notice Mario and jump, causing him to bounce over the edge and fall down. That way, we can bounce on him to get up this ledge. In Bowser in the Sky, we can knock into a Goomba when the Goomba's near the edge, causing him to bounce over the edge and fall down. And then we can bounce on him to get up this ledge. And also in Bowser in the Sky, we can get a Goomba to do a random jump near the edge to fall down, letting us bounce on him to get out of this little pit area. Then here's another way to get a Goomba to fall off an edge. See, if the floor slopes downhill at the edge and the Goomba's moving fast enough, the Goomba will end up doing little bounces and bounce right over the edge and fall down. Basically, the Goomba's moving horizontally faster than gravity can pull it downwards onto the ground, so it leaves the ground and bounces. Now note that if a Goomba falls down really far, he'll end up outside of his home range and can't get back. But he'll still try to get back by walking towards his home laterally. Fast forwarding a bit, and we see that he reached his home laterally, but he's still way below it and outside of his home range. So he just ends up walking in circles directly below his home. In Tall Tall Mountain, these Goombas are very prone to falling down due to the nature of this edge. Let's play it again, pause it, and look at it from the side. So here's the floor triangle, and here's the wall triangle. That wall's hitbox extends out 40 units on both sides, is offset to be 10 units lower than the wall triangle, and will push Goombas to the right. Now because the floor on the left is sloped, the top left corner of the wall hitbox actually juts above the floor. So as the Goomba walks to the right, he hits the wall hitbox and gets pushed off the ledge. So that's why these Goombas fall down so often. Also in Tall Tall Mountain, you may have seen these Goombas fall down because they can push each other off the edge. In Bowser in the Sky, this Goomba often falls down because the wall hitbox here also juts above the floor, And as you may have guessed, they never programmed Goombas to be affected by rotating platforms, so the Goomba can just walk in a straight line without getting rotated. And now he falls down again, but if I go down 2, I exit the Goomba spawner radius and he unloads. Then in Rainbow Ride, this Goomba can fall down and just stay stuck on this big platform down here. Goombas can also fall down onto the death barrier, and they don't die when they fall down there, they just walk back towards their home like we saw before. Although, if you punch a Goomba off the edge, then he will die once he lands on the death barrier. Now if you want to knock a Goomba down onto the death barrier yourself, an easy spot to do it is here in Tiny Huge Island. You can punch the Goomba from across this corner and have the Goomba fall down. Then we can see him down there, but we get ejected from the course before we fall low enough to bounce on him. So he thinks he's safe down there, but I know a trick. See, we can spawn a 100 coin star, because when Mario collects a star, he becomes immune from the death barrier until the star cutscene is over. Then I need the Goomba to go into the right spot, so I punch him a couple times to move him in that direction towards the edge. And finally, we're ready to put it all together. So I knock the Goomba down and then collect the star so I can go down too. Now I'm only gonna have a fraction of a second to get him, so watch closely. Take that. Did you see it? Let me play it again. There wasn't much time, but as you can see, I bounce on him and he gets squished. That'll teach him not to hide down here. So, we've seen ways of transporting Goombas horizontally and ways of making Goombas fall down. But are there any ways of raising a Goomba upwards? Well, as you know, Goombas can jump. Specifically, there are 3 different mechanisms that can make a Goomba jump. First, a Goomba can jump randomly as it's walking around. We'll call this a random jump. Second, Goombas will jump if they notice Mario. We'll call this a notice jump. And third, Goombas will jump if you collide with them. We'll call this a collision jump. So, those are the 3 kinds of jumps a Goomba can do. Now if we want to raise a Goomba high up, we'd have to chain together multiple jumps. You know, because each jump raises the Goomba by a bit, and so by putting many jumps together, the Goomba could in theory be raised very high. For example, you may have seen other tasks where we raise Scuttlebugs. The way that one works is that we get the Scuttlebug to jump and then deactivate him by moving away from his room so that he pauses in midair. Then once he's ready to jump again, we reactivate him, let him jump, and then deactivate him at the peak of his jump. And then we repeat that. So we basically only let him be active when he's jumping upwards and deactivate him when he tries to fall downwards. That allows us to chain together multiple jumps, raising him really high up. And I should mention, normally objects are completely invisible when they're deactivated, but in these visuals, I'll show deactivated objects as transparent so you can still see what's going on. So the question is, can we do something similar with Goombas to raise them really high? Well, consider the 3 kinds of jumps. And for now, let's just focus on the first 2. The thing about these 2 jumps is that the Goomba will only initiate them when he's in the walking action. And then once he starts a jump, he goes into the jumping action. In other words, these jumps transition the Goomba from walking to jumping. But in order to go back from jumping to walking, the Goomba has to touch the ground. Now our goal is to repeat this cycle multiple times because that would lead to multiple jumps. But a critical problem is that each cycle requires the Goomba to touch the ground. That's a bit of an issue because if the Goomba's rising upwards, then he wouldn't be near the ground anymore, and so it wouldn't be possible to keep doing the cycle. Let me show this in the game. So even if we deactivate a Goomba mid-jump, it doesn't do any good. He just stays there in the jumping action, and so he won't do any more jumps. It's only once he touches the ground again that he goes back into the walking action, and it's at that point that he is able to jump again. But there is something we can do. See, we can deactivate a Goomba, and the Goomba will still go through the motions of his random walking. I mean, he doesn't move around, but he's still doing movement decisions that cause him to turn. And you can also see him blinking. Now, because he's doing movement decisions, occasionally he'll jump. The jump doesn't go up because the Goomba can't move, but it still gives him vertical speed, which I'm representing with an arrow next to the Goomba. So going through it frame by frame, first, the Goomba's in the walking action as normal, then he jumps, which puts him into the jumping action with upward speed, but now, since he's still on the ground, it counts as him landing, and so he goes back into the walking action. In other words, the jump ended not because the Goomba came back down after the jump, but because the Goomba was still on the ground from before the jump. So now he's in the walking action, but still with upward speed. And so now if I reactivate him, he moves upwards while walking, not while jumping. That allows us to do the following technique. First, deactivate the Goomba, wait for him to jump, which gives him vertical speed, but he goes back into the walking action since he's still on the ground. Then we reactivate him right before he's about to do another jump. So first he moves upwards from the first jump's vertical speed, and then he does the second jump starting in midair. So we basically chained 2 jumps together, creating a double jump. But unfortunately, that's the most jumps you can chain together with this technique. Now, one other idea you might have would be to go near a Goomba right as he's doing a random jump in the hopes that he then does a notice jump while already in midair. But that's not what happens. Like, the Goomba can't do another jump until he lands and goes back into the walking action. That's why here, the Goomba waits until he lands and then does the notice jump. So that idea doesn't work. But remember, all of that analysis was for the first 2 kinds of jumps, specifically the random jump and notice jump. The constraint with these is that the Goomba will only initiate them from the walking action. But we still have to analyze the third kind of jump, a collision jump. This one doesn't have that constraint. You can collide with a Goomba while he's in any action, even while he's jumping in midair, and he'll still jump up. So could we chain together a bunch of collision jumps? Well, for huge Goombas, they do collision jumps both when Mario gets knocked back from the Goomba and when Mario attacks the Goomba. So using the shell in a steep slope, we can raise a huge Goomba really high up since our whole hitbox is constantly attacking him. So I can raise him all the way up here and then let him drop down. And here it is again from another angle. I raise him all the way up and then let him drop all the way down. So yeah, for huge Goombas, it's pretty easy to raise them high up by using the shell to attack them. Now for tiny Goombas, they don't do collision jumps because both knockback and attacks just kill them. But what about regular Goombas? Remember, attacking a regular Goomba just kills it, so we can't use the shell technique like with the huge Goombas. Instead, the only way to get a collision jump out of a regular Goomba is to get knockback from the Goomba. But the obvious problem is that after you get knockback, Mario ends up right next to the Goomba in the knockback action. That doesn't let Mario move around and is also followed by invincibility frames. And so by the time Mario's able to knock into the Goomba again, the Goomba's already fallen back down from the collision jump long ago. So for this technique to work, we'd have to bump into the Goomba, then before the Goomba falls down, somehow move 4,000 units away. That would deactivate the Goomba mid-jump and give Mario time for his invincibility frames to run out. Then we'd have to move 4,000 units back towards the Goomba within the time span of a few frames in order to knock into the Goomba again before he falls down. And then we'd have to repeat that whole process over and over. So it is all theoretically possible, but from what I can tell, no course has everything we'd need for the setup to work. And so that's why I made my own course to illustrate this technique. Look at that. So let me explain what we got here. On the left, there's a very long ramp. On the right, there's a big platform. On the platform is a Goomba. Under the edge of the platform is a pendulum. And on the very bottom of the course is a heart. So let me show you what we can do with this setup. So I start on that big platform on the right, then I get the Goomba's attention and lure him all the way over to the edge. I drop down so that the Goomba deactivates right on the edge. Now he starts spinning around forever like we talked about earlier, but that's not too important here. So anyway, I make my way to the left and then go up the ramp. Now the point of the ramp is so that I can get back up to the same height as the Goomba and then build up speed to launch over to him. So watch, I backwards long jump and then launch all the way over to the Goomba. Now a lot happened there, so let me play it again slowly. So I launch into the Goomba and collide with him, which causes him to do a collision jump. And then to get away quickly before he falls down, I use an invisible wall on the pendulum to squish me, which downwarps me all the way to the ground. That puts me far away enough from the Goomba so that he deactivates mid-jump. Now I do take some damage in the process, but that's why I put the heart there. So I go through the heart and recover to full health. And now we can just repeat this whole process. So I climb the ramp, launch over to the Goomba, hit him, get squished away, and then recover health. And each iteration I do this raises the Goomba by 1 jump. So yeah, it's very tedious and requires a specific setup, but it is theoretically possible to raise a Goomba high up. And let me just point out, the pyramid has Goombas at the bottom, and currently the pyramid requires an A press to get off of this pole. So in theory, if we could raise a Goomba all the way up to the pole, it could save an A press. Well actually, 2 A presses, because there are 2 stars involving the top of the pyramid. So if you want to make a name for yourself in the A button challenge, find a way to raise those Goombas all the way up here. Cause I'm just saying, there's not many A presses left that are likely to be saved. So we just talked about ways of having Mario raise a Goomba, but another important question is how high can the Goomba raise Mario? Which is especially important in the A button challenge where every unit of height matters. So the simplest way to get height from a Goomba is to just bounce on it, which can be good enough. If you need more height, you can do a rollout into the Goomba so that the Goomba jumps up from the collision and then you bounce on it while it's jumping up. And if you really need height, you can do the trifecta bounce. Get the Goomba to do a notice jump, then bump into him so that he does a collision jump in midair and then bounce on him. That's how getting onto this mesh in the pyramid was originally done in the A button challenge, though that also made use of a star dance clip where you collect a star to let you ledge grab. Then here's another thing. As we talked about, if you attack a Goomba, it'll move through the air before dying. Now, as it's moving through the air, it's intangible because the programmers didn't want you interacting with it anymore. But there's actually a 1-frame delay before this intangibility kicks in, meaning the Goomba is still tangible on that first frame that it moves through the air. Now normally, you wouldn't notice this 1-frame delay because Mario gets recoil away from the Goomba when he attacks it, so it's hard to interact with the Goomba on that 1 frame. But nevertheless, there are some ways to do it. For example, if we attack a Goomba from close enough, we can actually generate 2 sets of yellow particles instead of 1 set. So we attacked it the first time when it was on the ground, and then attacked it a second time on its first frame moving through the air. Note that you can kill a Goomba by crouch sliding into it if you're moving fast enough, so we can crouch slide into it to kill it, and then on its first frame moving through the air, have Mario no longer be moving fast enough so he gets knockback from the Goomba. So it looks pretty weird, both Mario and the Goomba get hurt from this maneuver. You can kill a Goomba by kicking it while you're in the air, so we can kick it in the air to kill it, and then on its first frame moving through the air, have Mario no longer be kicking so he ends up bouncing on the Goomba. So both Mario and the Goomba get propelled upwards from this encounter. You can also kill a Goomba by diving into it fast enough, so we can dive into it to kill it, and then on its first frame moving through the air, have Mario no longer be moving fast enough so he ends up bouncing on the Goomba. So this bounce goes a little higher than normal because we bounced on the Goomba while he was in the air instead of on the ground. Now flying will also kill Goombas if you're moving fast enough, but if you're moving slowly, it's actually possible to bounce on a Goomba mid-flight. Bet you never saw that before. Now we can also enter a cannon and then shoot at a Goomba. When you do this, it'll kill the Goomba so long as you're moving fast enough horizontally when you collide with him. So see, he got knockback from the cannon shot. But now watch this. If we aim really high up and then shoot, Mario doesn't move horizontally fast enough to give the Goomba knockback. So this time, he's able to bounce on the Goomba while he's still in the cannon shot action. So it looks very weird, he's just casually defying gravity while bouncing on the Goomba. And it's even possible to squish a Goomba while you're on the ground, specifically while you're landing after having thrown an object in midair. See, that landing action is actually encoded incorrectly because it's flagged as an air action. So since the game thinks Mario's in the air during the landing, he's able to squish the Goomba. Now Bob-ombs will kill Goombas if they interact, but there's actually a bug in this. See, the direction that the Goomba moves from the Bob-omb attack is actually directly away from Mario, not directly away from the Bob-omb. So if Mario's to the side of the Goomba gets propelled sideways. So him getting propelled that way doesn't look quite right. And if Mario's on the other side of the Goomba, away from the Bob-omb, then the Goomba will get propelled towards the Bob-omb. So him getting propelled that way definitely doesn't look right. Now if you throw a cork box into a Goomba, that'll also kill the Goomba, and the Goomba still gets propelled directly away from Mario instead of the box. Now if you drop the box instead of throwing it, then it won't kill the Goomba. The Goomba can just walk right through the box. But here's where it gets weird. If you throw the box will retain its active hitbox even if you then re-grab it and drop it. So now the Goomba will die off of a completely motionless box because the box still has its active hitbox from the earlier throw. Goombas can also go into water, though they'll die if they touch the ground too deep under the water. So here you can see him go into the water and then he dies once he goes deep enough. And for these visuals, it'll be helpful to show several of the Goomba's flags, which you can think of as properties that are either on or off. So we have flags for whether the Goomba is on the ground, is in the air, is leaving the ground, is landing on the ground, is on the ground in water, is in free fall in water, is entering water, and is at the surface of water. So here you can see a Goomba falling in the water, and he doesn't die until he touches the ground in the water. Or more specifically, he doesn't die until the flag for being on the ground in water turns on. though that flag has a bug in it. It turns on correctly when a Goomba touches the ground in water, but it doesn't turn off until the Goomba comes out of the water, even if the Goomba goes into free fall in the water. So if the Goomba touches the ground in water, the flag turns on and stays on. Then if the Goomba goes into free fall in the water, the flag is still on, so now the Goomba actually dies in midair in the water when it goes deep enough because it still thinks it's on the ground in the water. It's also possible to get a Goomba stuck in water, which happens when the Goomba does a jump while in the water. See, the jump action ends once the flag for being grounded turns on. But when a Goomba's on the ground in water, the grounded flag doesn't turn on at all. Instead, the grounded in water flag turns on. So the Goomba just remains in the jumping action, waiting for a flag to turn on that never will. And if the Goomba jumps right outside of the water, he can enter a state where he repeatedly oscillates in and out of the water. More specifically, the Goomba's oscillating between 3 different states. First, he's in freefall and falls through the ground into the water. Second, he's in water below the ground, so he snaps up onto the ground. And third, he thinks he's on the ground in the water, but he's actually above the water. So he exits the water and goes back into freefall. And that just repeats. He cycles through those 3 states for forever. So it looks pretty weird, and this can just happen on its own with no intervention from the player. And also, listen to the sound it makes. Now, Goombas die instantly if they're ever above lava. Not when they fall into lava and touch it, but just going anywhere above it. Now, these Goombas are right next to lava. So if one of these Goombas ever falls off, like by getting pushed by another Goomba, you'll see it die instantly. This can also happen from the Goomba jumping next to the ledge and bouncing over, and Goombas can also fall off the edge while running downhill. So here the Goomba runs downhill and falls off above this gap, causing him to die. Even if you punch a Goomba, it'll still die instantly once it goes above the lava. And so if you punch it right next to the lava, it'll look like the punch killed the Goomba on the spot. And we can even bounce on it on the frame that it dies from the lava. So we bounce up, but we don't see the Goomba get squished. Like, bouncing 1 frame earlier results in the Goomba getting squished and he falls onto the lava. And trying to bounce 1 frame later results in missing the Goomba entirely. But on that 1 frame, you can bounce on the Goomba and it doesn't get squished. Remember these 2 Goombas who walked really far away from their Goomba spawner? Well, watch this. I can bounce on one of them on the exact frame that I unload them from going far away from the Goomba spawner. So I bounce up, but we don't see the Goomba get squished. And then if I go back to the Goomba spawner, you can see that the Goomba I bounced on doesn't respawn. Like, we had 2 Goombas before, but now it's just 1. So the Goomba's dead, but we never actually saw him die. And we never even got a chance to get his coin. Now remember how I said attacking a huge Goomba just makes the Goomba bounce up instead of actually killing it? Well, that's not exactly true. See, if you attack a huge Goomba that belongs to a triplet, it actually still notifies the Goomba spawner that it died, due to an oversight in the code. So now, if I go far away to unload the Goombas, and then come back to reload the Goombas, the one that I attacked doesn't respawn. So he's just gone even though we never saw him die. So his coin is also forever lost. Now let's talk about Lakitu for a minute. See, Lakitu is this turtle enemy who rides around on a cloud. Now when you go close to his home, he throws Spinies at you. Spinies being these red spiky turtles. Now you can't kill a Spiny just by punching it. Like, punching it just moves it to the side a little. Now we can also get Lakitu to throw more than 1 Spiny. See, now we have 2 of them out at the same time. And I can get him to throw a 3rd one so that we have 3. Now note that 3 Spinies is the limit. Like, when there's 3 Spinies out, Lakitu knows not to throw any more until one of them despawns. And they can despawn if Mario goes far away from them. See, after I go far away, the Spinies aren't there anymore. Let me show this with a diagram. So here's Lakitu, and he has a variable that keeps track of how many Spinies are currently out. So as he throws Spinies, that number increases by 1 each time. And as we talked about, it can go up to a maximum of 3. Now let's say Mario moves away from a Spiny. So the Spiny despawns and notifies Lakitu that it despawned so that he can decrease the Spiny count by 1. That way, the Spiny count stays accurate. And then Lakitu would know that he could throw another Spiny. But you might be wondering, what does Lakitu or any of this have to do with Goombas? Well, here's how it relates. Let's say while some Spinies are out, Lakitu dies, and then a huge Goomba spawns into his same object slot. Now the Spinies think that the Goomba is Lakitu because the Goomba is their new parent object. And so we call this glitch Spiny Adoption. Now, the Goomba doesn't keep track of the Spiny count, but it does have a variable in that same spot that keeps track of its size. For this variable, 0 means medium-sized, 1 means huge, and 2 means tiny. Since this Goomba is huge, his variable would be 1 because 1 means huge. Now let's say a Spiny despawns. This time, it notifies the Goomba to decrease that same variable by 1. Which ultimately causes the huge Goomba to think that it's a medium-sized Goomba, since a size of 0 means medium. So let me show what this looks like in the game. So I get Lakitu to throw a Spiny, kill Lakitu, spawn a huge Goomba into Lakitu's object slot, and then move away from the Spiny so that the Spiny despawns and notifies the huge Goomba. Now the huge Goomba thinks it's medium-sized, so I can kill it with a punch. Cause remember, normally punches just make huge Goombas jump up. But this time it actually kills him. And I should clarify, even though his size variable is medium now, he still looks huge and has many huge properties, because those properties were set when he initialized and they don't change afterwards. So it's only a few properties that reflect this new medium size, like his reaction to a punch. We can also kill the huge Goomba with a different attack so that he gets vertical knockback and dies in midair. Note that getting knockback from the Goomba still results in losing 2 health, so that property didn't change. Bouncing on the Goomba results in 1 yellow coin, which is also normal. But now, ground pounding him also results in a yellow coin instead of a blue coin. So that property is different. So we just saw how 1 Spiny despawning will decrease the Goomba's size variable from 1 to 0. But if a second Spiny despawns, then the variable goes to -1. And if a third Spiny despawns, then the variable goes to -2. But sadly, these negative sizes don't really do anything interesting. See, when the game checks the Goomba size variable, it just checks whether the value is even or odd. So a Goomba size of -1 counts as huge because it's odd like 1, and a size of -2 counts as medium because it's even like 0. So here, I despawn 2 Spinies, causing the Goomba size to go from 1 to -1. That's still an odd number though, so the Goomba behaves exactly as a huge Goomba would. So basically, nothing is different at all, he still acts as he normally would. And then here, I despawn 3 Spinies, causing the Goomba size to go from 1 to -2. Now it's an even number, so the Goomba behaves like a medium Goomba, just like we saw earlier when we just despawned 1 Spiny. And now watch this. I kill a Goomba and his coin ends up on the upper floor. So then I go up there to collect the coin, but it doesn't work. The coin just won't let me collect it. So what's going on here? Well, let me explain. Here I am killing a Goomba, so let's pause it, zoom in, and hide the white puffs. So there's the coin that the Goomba produced. The coin starts out intangible, meaning you can't collect it yet, and it starts out with a positive vertical speed, meaning it'll move upwards. And that initial vertical speed is calculated by RNG, so its value is random. Now let's step through the frames. So the coin moves upwards, but by less and less each frame because it's affected by gravity. And the moment its vertical speed becomes negative, that's when it's programmed to become tangible, meaning you can collect it. In other words, the coin becomes collectible once it starts falling down. So here's a side view of a coin. This coin goes up, but not enough to reach the upper floor. And then once it starts falling down, it becomes tangible. So if a coin doesn't reach the upper floor, it works fine. Now remember, when you kick a Goomba, it dies in midair, meaning its coin starts out higher up. So here's a coin that starts higher up. This coin goes up, clips onto the floor, goes above the floor, then falls down and becomes tangible. So if a coin goes up high enough to go above the upper floor, it also works fine. But now watch this. This coin goes up and clips onto the floor at the peak of its trajectory. And so at no point was it falling down, meaning it never becomes tangible. In other words, a coin that just barely clips onto the upper floor will stay intangible. So that's what's going on. The coin just barely clips onto the next floor. Not too low, not too high, but just right. And that results in a coin that's impossible to collect since it never fell down and became tangible. And because the coin's vertical speed is determined by RNG, it's just random whether this will happen or not. Now, there's one more big topic we need to cover, which is a glitch called cloning, in which you can hold objects that aren't meant to be held. In the future, I'll probably make a big video dedicated to explaining this glitch, but for now, we're just gonna cover it in the context of Goombas. So, an interesting thing you can do in the game is grab a Bob-omb right as it explodes. This allows Mario to hold the Bob-omb even though the Bob-omb already despawned. And now if a new object like a Goomba loads into the same object slot that the Bob-omb had been occupying, Mario will end up holding the Goomba. And we call this process cloning the Goomba. But remember, the thing we see in Mario's hands is just a graphic of the object Mario's holding. The actual Goomba he's holding is still walking around like normal. But then if we throw the object, the real Goomba teleports over here. Though, the Goomba will now be in a broken state since Goombas were never programmed to be thrown. And we call this a Goomba clone. Now since Goomba clones are in a broken state, they don't walk around or even fall down from gravity. They just remain frozen in their current state. So if you release a Goomba clone while the Goomba's blinking, the Goomba clone stays blinking. If you release a Goomba clone while the Goomba's running, the Goomba clone stays running. And if you release a Goomba clone while the Goomba's getting squished, the Goomba clone stays squished. But the Goomba clone technically isn't stuck in place because other Goombas can still push the Goomba clone around. See, he pushed him a little bit. And Goomba clones actually still obey their draw distance. So I release a Goomba clone and then go far away. And once I go outside of his draw distance, he becomes inactive and disappears. And if I go back inside his draw distance, he becomes active again and reappears. Now interestingly, you can still interact with the Goomba clone one time and then never again. So this one interaction could be getting knockback from the Goomba, it could be attacking the Goomba, or it could be bouncing on the Goomba. But after the bounce, I can't bounce on it a second time or do any other interactions with it anymore. In other words, the Goomba clone is used up and can't be used for anything else. Well, okay, I guess it's not completely useless because a used up Goomba clone can still be used to detonate Bob-ombs, which can be useful if you want to have the Bob-omb explode without it chasing you. One issue though is that normally when you release a Goomba clone, you'll get knockback from it instantly, and that uses up the Goomba clone, so then we can't bounce on it. But there are a few ways to release a Goomba clone without using it up instantly. We can release it while falling really fast, because the fall moves Mario out of the Goomba clone's hitbox. We can release it while ledge grabbing, because the ledge grab moves Mario away from the Goomba clone's hitbox. We can release it by doing a rollout, because that releases the Goomba clone a bit farther away. We can release it while being inside of another Goomba's hitbox because that protects us from interacting with the Goomba clone. And we can release it as a result of receiving knockback like from another Goomba, because then Mario's intangible for a moment and so he avoids interacting with the Goomba clone. But the fact that we can bounce on Goomba clones means it's incredibly useful for the A button challenge, because now we can basically put a Goomba clone wherever we want in order to bounce up there. After all, who needs to press A to jump when you can just bounce on a bunch of Goomba clones? Now remember, you clone a Goomba by having the Goomba load into the same object slot that the Bob-omb had been using. That means we can only clone Goombas belonging to a triplet because those Goombas load when you go close to them. Singleton Goombas, on the other hand, are loaded the whole time, even when they're inactive, so we can't get them to load into the Bob-omb's object slot. Now once you clone a Goomba, that Goomba doesn't unload anymore when you go far away from the Goomba spawner, since that Goomba's in a broken state. And then if you go close to the Goomba spawner again, all 3 Goombas will respawn, even the one I cloned. So now we have the Goomba that I cloned from before who never disappeared, and 3 new Goombas. And note that this applies even if you attack the Goomba clone. Like, attacking the Goomba clone doesn't notify the Goomba spawner that the Goomba died. So now if I go far away and come back, all 3 Goombas still respawn. And so you can put a bunch of Goomba clones down without detracting from the original Goombas, and then bounce on all of them. You can even clone the Mystery Goomba because he belongs to a triplet. Then we can release him and bounce on him. But he's not technically dead because he'd respawn if we went away and came back. Plus, this doesn't let us collect his coin. But it is cool that we finally get to see him up close. I'll get you one day, Mystery Goomba. I don't know when, but one day. You can also clone a huge Goomba in Tiny Huge Island. There's no Bob-ombs here, so instead I use Chuckya. So I grab Chuckya and bring him all the way up the mountain. Then I throw him over a steep floor so that he doesn't move laterally in the air, and I'm able to grab him right as he breaks. Then I bring him into the water so that I'm holding a light object instead of a heavy object. So now I'm in a good state because I'm holding a vacant object slot, meaning that it can turn into other objects that load into that slot, and I can move around freely because I'm no longer bound by Chuckya's heaviness. So now I manipulate the object slots using water bubbles, and then I have a huge Goomba load into the object slot that I'm holding. And voila, I've cloned a huge Goomba, who basically behaves exactly the same as a regular Goomba clone. But note that you can't clone a Tiny Goomba because there's no Tiny Goomba spawners and there's no grabbable objects in this area. Now, one limitation of Goomba cloning is that the Goomba clone can only be released when the Goomba you cloned is still loaded. See, if you unload the Goombas and then release the Goomba clone disappears. And that's because you're releasing a Goomba that doesn't actually exist. So if you want to release a Goomba clone properly, the Goomba you cloned has to still be loaded. And that means Mario has to be near the Goomba spawner, specifically within this radius. That's a bit of an issue because ideally we'd be able to release Goomba clones wherever we wanted in the course, not just constrained to near the Goomba spawner. But luckily, there's a solution, which gets even more complicated. As we've discussed, when Mario holds an object, the thing we see in his hands is just a graphic of the object he's holding. The actual object is somewhere else. Now, when Mario throws the object, the game stops rendering the graphic and teleports the real object over to where the graphic was being rendered. That way, the transition from graphic to object looks seamless. But how does the game know exactly where to teleport the object to? Well, the way it works is that the game keeps track of the position of the graphic in Mario's hands. So the X coordinate, Y coordinate, and Z coordinate of that held graphic are stored in memory in a variable, keeping track of its position. We call that position the HOLP, or held object's last position. And we're gonna represent that position with a pink star symbol. So, as Mario moves around with a held object, the HOLP updates every frame to the position of the graphic in his hands. And the HOLP is used by the game to determine where the real object teleports to when you release it. Specifically, when Mario throws an object, the object appears at the HOLP, but offset 32 units in the direction that Mario's facing. And when Mario drops an object, the object appears at the HOLP laterally, but at Mario's current height. So you can see that when Mario holds the box, the HOLP updates every frame to be the position of the graphic in his hands. And when Mario releases the box, the HOLP stays where it was in the air because it no longer updates its position. Like, it literally only updates its position when the graphic in Mario's hands gets rendered. Now, there's another relevant glitch that goes as follows. You open the wing cap block, wait a bit so that the wing cap block comes back, open it again, collect the 2 caps in a row, and then you'll be holding your hat in your hand. So why does that happen? Well, normally when you put on a cap, Mario goes into the putting on his cap action and does the putting on his cap animation. As you can see, he starts the action with his cap in his hand, then the cap goes back onto his head, and then when the animation finishes, he's done with the action and just goes back into the standing action. But now let's watch him put on 2 caps in a row. The first cap goes just fine. He goes into the putting on his cap action and does the putting on his cap animation. And then for the second cap, you'd think he'd do the same thing again, but he doesn't because there's an issue. See, here's the code for setting Mario's animation, which gets executed both the first time and second time Mario puts on the cap. But you see, it only goes through with updating the animation if the new animation is different from the current animation. So if Mario's already in that animation, then this code does nothing, not even resetting the animation to its start frame. So basically, when Mario puts on the cap for the second time, the animation doesn't reset properly because he was still in that animation from the first time. So the animation stays finished, which ends up causing the action to end prematurely. You know, the action for putting on the cap the second time. In fact, that action ends right when it starts, which is at a moment when Mario has his hat in his hand. Because remember, the action starts with Mario having his hat in his hand, and it's only later that the hat goes onto his head. But since the action ends prematurely, it ends before the hat goes onto his head, leaving Mario with his hat in his hand. So yeah, now he has his hat in his hand, which might not seem like much, but here's the thing. When Mario holds an object, the graphic that gets rendered in his hands is actually tied to the model used for his right hand. Here you can see that his right hand is right at the bottom center of the box, which is the position of the graphic. Even when Mario throws the box, the graphic stays attached to his right hand. But when Mario holds his hat in his hand, a different model is used for his right hand. Like, instead of the default hand model, it's using the hand model that holds his hat. And this model was never programmed to show the graphic of the held object. So if we pick up an object while holding our hat, we don't actually see the held graphic in Mario's hands. And that means the HOLP doesn't update because the HOLP is specifically tied to where the graphic in Mario's hands gets rendered. and in this case, it's not getting rendered. Now, if we release the object, it still appears at the hope as it's programmed to, but now the hope can be really far away. In other words, the object can be released remotely. And remember how it works. When we throw an object, it appears at the hope, but offset 32 units in Mario's facing direction. And when we drop an object, it appears at the hope laterally, but at Mario's current height. So let me show how this can be useful. Let's say I want to place a Goomba clone near Chain Chomp. So the naive approach would be to clone a Goomba and then go over to Chain Chomp. But you can see that as I'm walking there, the Goomba I cloned unloads because I walked too far away from the Goomba spawner. So by the time I get to Chain Chomp, the Goomba doesn't exist, and so releasing the Goomba clone doesn't do anything. So instead, we can do the following. Grab an object and place that object where we want the future Goomba clone to be, because that sets the hope there. Then do the hat in hand glitch so that we no longer update the hope. Now grab a Bob-omb right as it explodes, clone a Goomba, and then release the Goomba clone. And so the Goomba clone appears at the hope that we set earlier. And that means we can place Goomba clones wherever we want in the course, because now we're no longer bound by the Goomba spawner's radius. For example, as we saw earlier, the star Scale the Mountain in Tall Tall Mountain is too high up to reach with a rollout. So one of the first ways this star was collected without pressing A was as follows. We place the hope near the star, do the hat in hand glitch, clone a Goomba, and release the Goomba clone remotely at the hope, and then when we go back up, the Goomba clone is there, which lets us bounce up into the star. However, often one Goomba clone doesn't provide enough height for what you want to do. Instead, you need multiple Goomba clones. So let me show you how that might work. And remember, each Goomba clone can only be used once. So to make things easier to understand, I'll make Goomba clones green if they haven't been used up yet, and red if they have been used up. So first I place a Goomba clone next to a ledge. I can't avoid hitting this first one, so I use it up instantly. So that one's like a sacrifice Goomba just to get things started. Next I clone another Goomba and place it on the ledge. This time I can avoid touching the Goomba clone instantly because I'm using the first Goomba clone's hitbox as protection. Now I clone another Goomba, bounce on the previous clone, and place this new clone up in the air. But since that maneuver uses up the Goomba on the bottom layer, we're going to need to place another Goomba there. So we clone another Goomba and place it on the bottom, effectively restocking the bottom layer. And so with all of that, now we have 2 layers of bounceable Goombas, so we can bounce up twice. And we call this a Goomba ladder because each Goomba layer is like one rung of a ladder. Now if we wanted to bounce even higher than 2 layers, we could clone a 5th Goomba and release it at the top, clone a 6th Goomba and release it at the bottom, clone a 7th Goomba and release it in the middle, clone an 8th Goomba and release it on the bottom, and now we have 3 layers of bounceable Goombas so we can bounce up 3 times. And in theory, you could just keep repeating this process to bounce higher and higher, though too many Goombas on screen will crash the game. So when you build a Goomba structure like this, it takes an exponential number of Goombas to construct. Bouncing up 1 layer takes 2 Goombas, bouncing up 2 layers takes 4 Goombas, bouncing up 3 layers takes 8 Goombas, and this pattern continues with it doubling each time. So the formula for this is y equals 2 to the power of n. Though there is a trick to squeeze in 1 extra bounce. See, we bring a Goomba clone up the ladder, release it at the top, and immediately bounce on it. I call this trick the Insta-Bounce. In the A button challenge, a Goomba ladder was used in an early strat for Bowser in the Sky, specifically to get past this pole. So using a lot of Goombas, I managed to create a Goomba ladder on top of this blue prism. And then once all the Goombas were in place, I was able to bounce up them and reach the next section. Now, the Goomba structure can have different orientations. When it's vertical, we call it a Goomba ladder. When it's at an angle, we call it a Goomba staircase. And when it's horizontal, we call it a Goomba bridge. But remember, building these structures, as we saw before, takes an exponential number of Goombas. Surely there must be a better way, right? Well, eventually we did find a way. See, if we're able to release Goomba clones remotely, then we can do the following. Place the hope somewhere, do the hat in hand glitch, then throw multiple Goomba clones all to that same hope. But we make sure Mario's facing different angles on each throw so that each Goomba ends up in a slightly different position. Because remember, when you throw an object, it appears at the hope, but offset 32 units in the direction that Mario's facing. So using 1 hope value, we can place multiple Goomba clones all in slightly different positions. And that lets Mario bounce on all of them. Here's a top-down view of the situation. So the first Goomba clone was thrown southwest of the hope, the second Goomba clone was thrown south of the hope, and the third Goomba clone was thrown southeast of the hope. And here the Goomba's 3 hitboxes, which are cylinders. But you can see that the earlier Goomba's hitboxes overshadow the later Goomba's hitboxes. So the later Goomba's hitboxes are just tiny slivers where they aren't being covered up. So Mario is able to bounce on all 3 of the Goombas because their hitboxes don't completely overlap. Like, each of them has some of their own area. And we call this formation a Goomba cluster, which is multiple Goomba clones all thrown at one hope but at different angles so that you can still bounce on all of them. Now, Goomba clusters make building Goomba structures much more efficient, because now each layer of the structure can be stocked all at once instead of one at a time after bouncing up to that layer. Let me show you by building another Goomba ladder that's 3 layers tall. So first we place the hope on the bottom layer, do the hat in hand glitch, remotely release 3 Goomba clones at the hope to create a Goomba cluster on the bottom layer, undo the hat in hand glitch by picking up another wing cap, bounce on a Goomba to place the hope on the second layer, do the hat in hand glitch, remotely release 2 Goomba clones at the hope to create a Goomba cluster on the second layer, undo the hat in hand glitch, bounce on Goombas to place the hope on the third layer, do the hat in hand glitch, and release 1 Goomba clone at that hope on the third layer. Now we have 3 layers of bounceable Goombas, so we can bounce up 3 times. And it only took 6 Goombas instead of 8, so we saved a whole 2 Goombas. Okay, admittedly, we don't see a huge reduction of Goomba clones when there's only 3 layers. But looking at the graph again, we can see that this new technique is way more efficient when there are a lot of layers, because now it takes a quadratic number of Goombas instead of an exponential number. More specifically, this time the formula is y equals n times n plus 1 over 2. And a little fun fact, this sequence is actually known as the triangle numbers because it's like building bigger and bigger triangles. So when we compare the numbers from last time to the numbers for this time, we see that this new way is much more efficient. So let's look at some more places where Goomba structures were used. In the A button challenge, a Goomba bridge was used to get to the island in Bob-omb Battlefield. A Goomba staircase was used to get up to the Chain Chomp star. In the Coinless challenge, a Goomba staircase was used to get up to the secrets in Bob-omb Battlefield, and that one also made use of a bunch of bowling ball clones. And later, for the Coinless Capless Cannonless challenge, a Goomba staircase was also used for that same star. Then going back to the A button challenge, a very early version of Bowser in the Sky used a ton of Goomba clones all throughout the last section. Basically, we want to bring a Goomba clone all the way over to the warp pipe so that we can bounce into the warp pipe without having to press A to jump into it. However, there are a bunch of points along the path where you can't carry a Goomba clone past them because it requires a jump. But that means we can place Goomba clones at those points to let Mario bounce past them while carrying later Goomba clones. But of course, that uses up the Goomba clones, so then you have to restock those points several times. So this process took 63 Goomba clones in all. But that's how we first entered the warp pipe without pressing A. A Goomba clone was also used to get past the big pole in Bowser in the Sky. In this case, we actually used the Goomba clone to get knockback and then bounce off of a different Goomba. And Goomba clones were used in Bowser in the Fire Sea to help place a flame clone right at the top of the pole. That way, we can get past it without pressing A on our second trip past the pole. You can't use this strategy on the first trip though, because it makes use of the Bob-omb that's later in the level. Now, there's one more aspect of Goomba cloning that we need to cover, but to understand it, we need to go back and analyze Goombas colliding again. Previously, we analyzed how Goombas colliding affected their target angles, but Goombas colliding also affects the positions of the Goombas. So firstly, Goombas, like all objects, have a hitbox, which is a cylinder around the Goomba. Now, 2 Goombas are considered colliding if their hitboxes overlap. When this happens, the game pushes the Goombas apart so that their hitboxes no longer overlap. But let me show you how this pushing apart works in more detail. So let's say the Goombas walk into each other, then the game finds the midpoint between the Goombas, and it finds the angle between the Goombas. Then it simply moves the Goombas along that angle line so that their hitboxes are exactly tangent at the midpoint. Then here's another setup where 3 Goombas collide. But we're gonna be even more thorough this time because Goomba collision actually has 2 different steps to it. So the first step is that the game goes through every pair of Goombas and sees if they're touching, in which case we'll call them neighbors. So for these 2 Goombas, they are touching, then for these 2 Goombas, they're touching, and then for these 2 Goombas, they're not touching, so nothing to mark there. So now you can see that each Goomba keeps track of its neighbors. So the Goomba on the left has 2 neighbors, the Goomba on the bottom has 1 neighbor, and the Goomba on the top also has 1 neighbor. And then the second step is that every Goomba handles the push with its first neighbor. So for that Goomba with 2 neighbors, we're actually going to discard its second neighbor, because that just doesn't play any role in this step. So now for each Goomba with a neighbor, we show the midpoint, draw the line between the Goombas, and then move the Goombas along that line to be tangent at the midpoint. And then that happens for the second Goomba, and then it happens for the third Goomba. So now you understand the 2 steps of Goomba collision. First, find the neighbors, and then second, get pushed away from the neighbors. But here's where cloning kinda messes everything up. See, if Mario releases a Goomba clone while that Goomba is colliding with another Goomba, then things get a little weird. And that's because the step of releasing the clone happens between the other 2 steps. So now let's go through all 3 steps to understand what happens when you release a Goomba clone while that Goomba is colliding with another Goomba. So, let's say we have Goomba A on the left and Goomba B on the right, and they walk into each other. First step, we go through the Goomba pairs and see who's colliding. Both Goombas have their hitboxes overlapping, so they're colliding and have each other as neighbors. Next step, we release the Goomba clone. So let's say Mario's here with his hat in his hand, holding Goomba A, and the Hulp is over here. So Mario throws the Goomba, which places the Goomba at the Hulp. And then the last step, we handle the pushing between the Goombas. Now you might say, hey, the Goombas aren't even touching at this point, so there's no need to handle the pushing between them. But the Goombas still have each other as neighbors, so this pushing step is gonna happen anyway. Though for the Goomba that we threw, he's now in a broken state, because remember, Goombas aren't meant to be thrown. So even though he has a neighbor, he's not actually gonna do the pushing step. But for the other Goomba, his neighbor will be handled just as normal. So here's the midpoint between the Goombas, here's the line between them, and then we move the Goombas along that line until they're tangent at the midpoint. Now normally that step would move Goombas apart, but in this case it pulls them together. So to recap, the Goombas collided over here on the right, one Goomba was thrown to the Hulp on the left, but in the end, both Goombas end up midway between those 2 points. In other words, both the Goomba we threw and the other Goomba end up being transported to midway between the collision spot and the Hulp. So we call this a transport clone because the clone transported another Goomba along with it. So let's see what transport cloning looks like in the game. First I place the Hulp over here, do the hat in hand glitch, then clone a Goomba and release that Goomba while he's colliding with another Goomba. So you can see that both the Goomba clone and the other Goomba end up midway between the collision spot and the Hulp. But now let's analyze it in more detail. So Mario throws the Goomba clone on this frame. So looking at the Goombas, we can see that their hitboxes are touching, so they're both each other's neighbor. Now zooming out a bit, the Goomba we threw ends up at the Hulp, and his neighbor doesn't matter anymore because he's in a broken state. And then the other Goomba handles the push with his first neighbor, causing both Goombas to end up at the midpoint between their current positions. So that's why they end up there after the throw. But that was just the simplest case of a transport clone. See, we can arrange it so that the Goomba we're holding collides with 2 other Goombas at the time of the throw, causing both those other Goombas to get transported to different spots. So let me show you how this one works. Mario throws the Goomba clone on this frame. So looking at the Goombas, we can see that their hitboxes are all touching, so here are the neighbors. But remember, we're only concerned with each one's first neighbor. Now zooming out a bit, the Goomba we threw ends up at the Hulp, and his neighbor doesn't matter anymore. Then this Goomba handles the push, causing these 2 Goombas to go to the midpoint, and then the other Goomba handles his push, causing these 2 Goombas to go to the midpoint. So the first Goomba ends up halfway between the collision spot and the Hulp, while the second Goomba ends up a quarter of the way between the collision spot and the Hulp, because he basically got midpointed twice. So that's why they end up there after the throw. But we're not done yet because we can also get the Koopa involved. So now we have 4 enemies. And so if I throw the Goomba clone while they're all touching, they all get transported away. So let's see what's going on this time. Mario throws the Goomba clone on this frame. So looking at the enemies, we can see that their hitboxes are all touching, so here are the neighbors. But we're only concerned with each one's first neighbor. Now zooming out a bit, the Goomba we threw ends up at the Hulp, and his neighbor doesn't matter anymore. Then the Koopa handles his push, then one of the Goombas handles his push, and then the other Goomba handles his push. So that's why they end up in those spots. But we're actually still not done because I have one more case to show you. See, we can use a hands-free teleported Bob-omb to push a singleton Goomba over to the rest of the enemies, and we also do that for the other singleton Goomba in the level. Now I place the Hulp extra far away so that we can really see the magnitude of the midpoints. Then I do the hat in hand glitch, and I clone one of the Goombas. Now getting 6 enemies to all walk into each other at the same time was no easy feat, but I did manage to do it. And I didn't even use any brute forcing, it was all tasked by hand. So I manipulate the enemies just right so that they all walk into each other at the same time, and then I throw the Goomba clone. So the enemies end up in a bunch of different positions, and we'll see how they got there in a moment. And the Goomba I cloned actually ends up under the course because he's at the height of the Hulk. So let me show you what went on. Mario throws the Goomba clone on this frame, so looking at the enemies, we can see that their hitboxes are all touching, so here are the neighbors, but we're only concerned with each one's first neighbor. Now zooming out a lot, the Goomba we threw ends up at the Hulk, and his neighbor doesn't matter anymore. Then one of the singleton Goombas handles his push, then the other singleton Goomba handles his push, then the Koopa handles his push, then one of the triplet Goombas handles his push, and then the other triplet Goomba handles his push. So yeah, a lot going on there, but that's how they all ended up in those spots. And transport clones give rise to another kind of Goomba structure. I'll show this using a diagram. So let's say we have a Goomba spawner on the left, meaning we have 3 Goombas who can collide roughly anywhere within this radius, and let's say the Hulk is on the right. Now let's say 2 of the Goombas walk into each other, and so they collide right here. So the collision point is on the left, and the Hulk is on the right. And so if we did a transport clone at the moment, the resulting Goomba clone would end up midway between those 2 points, which would be right here. Now if the collision were down here, then the resulting Goomba clone would end up down here. If the collision were on the top, then the Goomba clone would end up on the top. If the collision were on the left, then the Goomba clone would end up on the left. And if the collision were on the right, then the Goomba clone would end up on the right. So basically, the transport clones will all end up in this blue circle. More specifically, wherever they collide in the red circle, they'll end up at the corresponding spot in the blue circle. And note that this blue circle is located midway between the Goomba spawner and the Hulk and is half the size of the red circle. Now when you throw a transport clone, the Goomba you throw ends up at the height of the Hulk while the other Goomba stays at its current height. So let's say we place the Hulk high up in the air. Then when we throw the transport clone, it ends up high up in the air but still laterally midway between the collision point and the Hulk. So that means we can use this setup to place a bunch of Goomba clones in the air anywhere within that blue circle that we talked about before. Let me show what this would look like. So let's say the Hulk is up here in the air, then on the left we have these Goombas who might collide anywhere within this area, and so based on those, the blue circle would be here. Laterally, it's midway between the Hulk and the red circle, but it's also high up in the air at the height of the Hulk. So using that single Hulk value, we can place transport clones anywhere within this blue circle. Like, normally you can only place Goomba clones at the Hulk itself, meaning if we wanted to place a bunch of spread out Goomba clones in the air, it would take multiple different Hulk values, which would cost a lot of Goomba clones to bounce up there and set those Hulks. But using this technique, we can place a bunch of spread out Goomba clones in the air just by using a single Hulk value. And we call this structure a Goomba Oasis, referencing how easy and cheap it is to place Goombas there. Like, if we were to draw a heat map of how costly it is to place a Goomba clone high up in the air, it would be relatively cheap at the top of the mountain, but get harder and more costly as we move away from there. But the Goomba Oasis is like a special exception to that cost, where Goombas are cheap to place. Now you might be wondering what star would require a Goomba Oasis. Well, it was in the A button challenge for the star Mario Wings to the Sky in Bob-ombs Battlefield. To get this star, you're supposed to get the wing cap, go into the cannon, shoot from the cannon, and then collect the 5 secrets in the air, which are at the center of the 5 coin rings, and that spawns the star for you to collect. But in the A button challenge, we can't press A. So that means we can't shoot from the cannon because that requires pressing A, and we can't fly because that requires pressing A. So somehow we have to get these 5 secrets with no cannon, no flying, and no jumping. Now you can see that the first 3 secrets are relatively low, the 4th secret is higher up, and the 5th secret is really high up. So for the first 3 secrets that are low down, it's actually possible to build up speed on the Koopa shell and launch from the top of the mountain into those secrets. So those 3 secrets are relatively easy because they're low enough to reach with just a horizontal launch. But for the 4th and 5th secrets, we're gonna have to get creative with Goomba clones. So one idea would be to build a Goomba staircase up to the 5th secret and then redirect it at the end to go to the 4th secret. But redirecting sideways would add on a lot of extra Goomba clones, so many that it would probably crash the game. On the other hand, we could try building 2 Goomba staircases, one to the 5th secret and one to the 4th secret, but that would also be so many Goomba clones that it would likely crash the game. So the solution I came up with many years ago was to place a Goomba Oasis around the 4th and 5th secrets, because those Goombas don't cost much. Then we can use a Goomba staircase to get up to the Oasis, navigate on the Oasis to the 5th secret, and then navigate on the Oasis to the 4th secret. And that's exactly what I did. So first I created a separate Goomba staircase to set the hope really high up. This is the hope that we analyzed earlier that was high up on the right side. Now once I placed the hope there, I exited out and re-entered the course because that clears all the Goomba clones but preserves the hope. Then I got the Koopa shell, built up hyperspeed, and launched to collect the 1st secret, launched to collect the 2nd secret, and launched to collect the 3rd secret. Then I constructed the Goomba Oasis. So I released several transport clones that all ended up near the 4th and 5th secrets in strategic positions that I would bounce on later. Then I constructed the Goomba staircase up to the Oasis, and so that let me bounce all the way up to the 5th secret and then redirect my momentum and bounce into the 4th secret. So yeah, that's how all the secrets were collected without having to press A. No cannon required, no flying required, just a Koopa shell and a whole ton of Goomba clones. And here it is again from another angle. It's a pretty crazy achievement, basically creating new domains of Goomba engineering just to get this 1 star in the A button challenge. So now we know 2 more ways of releasing a Goomba clone without immediately getting hit by it. You can release the Goomba clone remotely by using the hat in hand glitch, or wait for the Goomba you're holding to collide with another Goomba and then release it as a transport clone so that it ends up midway between you and the collision point. Now, remember how Goombas push each other away when they collide? That ensures that the Goombas aren't able to walk through each other. But remember, I said they only handle collision with their first neighbor, not any other neighbor. That's why if 3 Goombas all run into each other, 2 of them can pass straight through each other, because both of their first neighbors were the 3rd Goomba, not each other. So they don't push against each other at all and can just walk right through each other. Also, if Mario's near 2 Goombas, then those 2 Goombas are able to pass through each other. Because this time, Mario himself is the first neighbor of those 2 Goombas instead of having each other as neighbors. So yeah, don't get surprised if you see Goombas walking through each other. And then here's something cool. We can lure 1 Goomba onto the hill, then lure another Goomba over, and when they collide, 1 Goomba pushes the other Goomba straight through the floor. Now earlier, I showed that you could do this using the hands-free teleported Bob-omb. But as you can see here, you don't even need to do that. You can just get 1 Goomba to push the other Goomba through. And now for the final glitch. See, it's actually possible to get 1 Goomba to pull another Goomba along with it. Like the Goomba who's running pulls the Goomba who's walking. So what's going on here? Well, let's play it again, pause it, look at it from a top-down view, hide Mario, and show the Goomba hitboxes. Now let's walk through the steps of a frame. So first, the Goombas are colliding, so they're both each other's first neighbor. Now we process the Goomba on the right, so he handles the push with the other Goomba, and then he runs forwards. Now we process the Goomba on the left. So he handles the push with the other Goomba and then he walks forwards. And then on the next frame, it all happens again. The Goombas are still colliding, so they're each other's neighbors. And you can see that even though the Goomba on the right runs away from the Goomba on the Goomba on the left is able to catch back up. And that's because the last thing that happens each frame is that the left Goomba's push puts the 2 Goombas adjacent to each other, and then the left Goomba walks a little to the right, so their hitboxes end up still overlapping by the end of the frame. And that just keeps repeating. So in general, this will happen when 2 Goombas are colliding and the one that's processed second is walking into the one that's processed first. Now remember, Spinies can also push against Goombas. So using the same principle as before, we can have a huge Goomba pull a Spiny. So it looks a bit weird. Like, the Goomba's moving slower than normal because he's being dragged down by the Spiny. And the Spiny's moving faster than normal because he's being pulled by the Goomba. So it's like they're connected. But eventually the Goomba does get out of it when the Spiny turns and stops walking into him. And so there you have it, that's every Goomba glitch in the game. So now you know all there is to know about Goombas. We can raise them, we can drop them, we can move them, we can stop them. We can release a Goomba clone basically anywhere and use that to make structures like ladders and stairs. We can even make a structure that reaches the sky and bounce on that structure to go really high. So much information about a creature so small because Goombas are the enemy that's glitchiest of all. Thanks for watching. And now for this video's member event. In case you don't know, at the end of all my regular videos, all the members of my channel participate in a member event. And what could be more fitting on a Goomba video than turning everyone into Goombas? And if you're paying for a higher tier to have a colored name, then your Goomba will also be colored. So it's extra personalized just for you. Now if you haven't figured it out yet, we're having a Goomba Battle Royale. So the goal is to push the other Goombas off of the platform, and the last Goomba remaining wins. Now I did modify the Goomba behavior a bit so that they'll target each other, and I also fixed the bug that switches the X and Z axes when Goombas collide. That way, the Goombas won't get stuck in a Goomba Gridlock. Instead, they'll always reflect off of each other when they collide. And that's everyone. Man, look at all of them. They're so organized, so peaceful and calm. They're just waiting for me to give the go-ahead so that they can go ballistic on each other. And so if everyone's ready, let's begin. Oh man, it is Goomba Pandemonium in here. Everyone's falling off. We've already lost Alan 1350, HK Jacket, Crix, Eric Vilas, Valton Zenola, Toshigun 1337, Rageman, Kdax, PJ Sands, Quite the Handful, and Lil Gamers. Here's a little pro tip for you guys, maybe try staying away from the edges, like you can't really fall off in the middle. Now we've lost the idle modding expert and Buprofin 64. Coming through. Excuse me sir, don't mind me. Let's see what's going on in the corner. Risk Dreamer. I saw that push, nice work. I demand more pushing everyone, more pushing! Now we've lost JR Kamukstum, Sither, Cheddar, Johannes Joestar, and Mr. Fanciful. And with this bird's eye view, you can really see how much we've already thinned the herd. Now let's tune in to everyone's favorite guy, Lunar Complex. No, don't go towards the edge. Were you paying attention to me earlier? Here I am giving out great advice and you guys are just ignoring me and doing your own thing. Okay, let's take a look at this corner. We got a few Goombas here. Looks like George found a victim. Person to teach a valuable life lesson. Looks like Jesse Werner pushed someone off and then got pushed off himself. So it's like, if you go near the edge to push someone off, you yourself become susceptible to getting pushed off. But that's the duality of being in a Goomba Battle Royale. And this just in, we've lost MX8, Vlader, Biggs22, Lugmalord, Shauna, and the Flying Fire. I like how the Goombas are starting to form little groups amongst themselves. And within each group, they're trying to push each other off, but don't really care much about other groups. Lunar Complex, how are you still alive? You just almost got pushed off by Sean Glaze. And there's Crazy Frog Vampire 2. I guess Crazy Frog Vampire 1 couldn't make it. Man, Sean Glaze is really going after Lunar Complex. But wait, Sean hit Crazy Frog and turned around. Now Lunar Complex isn't back and has the advantage. And he pushed him off. Any last words, Sean? I see. Hello, Adam Baxter. How are you doing today? Trying to push some people off? I see you're going after Nathan Perkins and Weird TH. But you might want to keep track of who's behind you because Daniel Leo just pushed you off. Let's take a look at what's going on in this corner. Hello Cubic, I love your color scheme, and goodbye. Looks like we have two groups of Goombas now. A little group on the southwest corner and a big group up northeast. So let's take a look at the big group. Who do we have here? We got Morphstar Changeling, Bugdeal, Ginson, and Weird TH. Watch out Weird TH, and he's gone. Though to be fair, he was a little weird. Oh no, Morphstar Changeling, don't go near the edge, not with Lunar Complex right behind you. Trust me, I've seen how that one works out. And now we have three groups of Goombas. And Lunar Complex does in fact push off Morphstar Changeling. I did try to warn him. And now our group is being joined by another group. And they're forming a conga line and marching right up to the edge. Oh man, everyone's falling down. We lost Lunar Complex, 01737, and Mason Bowles. So congrats to our 5 finalists. In the far group, we have Cathrarg, Smudge, and iMob. Just kidding, iMob fell off. And in our close group, we have Loose Mad XD, who just fell off, and Nathan Perkins. Okay Nathan, this is your chance. Show me what you can do. Cause now we're down to the final 3. Cathrarg, Smudge, and Nathan Perkins. What happens now is anyone's guess. Nathan coming in strong towards Cathrarg. Cathrarg goes to the edge, but Nathan turns away at the last moment, missing his chance. And now Cathrarg is on the attack. But Cathrarg gets pushed off by Smudge, and Smudge pushes off Nathan as well, who was trapped in the corner. And that's it. Smudge is our final Goomba remaining on the platform. All the other Goombas have been eliminated. So, congrats to our first place finisher, Smudge, and everyone else will be ranked by how long they lasted before falling off. So yeah, that's what a member event is like. So if you want to get in on the next one, consider becoming a member of my channel. To do that, you click on the join button below the video or use the link in the description. And I'm very thankful that so many of you guys have become members. You guys are amazing. Like, this video took 5 months to make, so it's very reassuring that you guys are still supporting me after I sort of disappeared for 5 months. But I didn't really disappear, I was working on this video the whole time. I mean, I thought this video would only be like 40 minutes when I started making it. How was I supposed to know that there'd be 2 hours worth of Goomba glitches to cover? So let me know, do you like these bigger videos or do you prefer smaller videos? Now I should mention, one of my goals in this new era is to explain basically every glitch in the game. Like, someone's gotta document everything. And so one series of videos I'm gonna be making is covering every glitch for each enemy. That just seems like a good way of organizing the information. But of course, I have lots of other video ideas too. Like, sometimes someone will ask me, what are you gonna do when you run out of content for this game? But it's like, if I can talk about Goombas for 2 hours, I don't think I'm gonna be running out of content anytime soon. And that brings me to my final point. I said previously that if things went well, this could become my full-time job. And guess what? With everyone's support, that appears to be possible now. So it's official, I'm doing this full-time now. I just get to spend the rest of my life documenting things about Super Mario 64. My absolute dream job. And it's all thanks to you. Thank you guys. In fact, we have to do something special for you. So, here's a little special something. The Mystery Goomba, he's here. Now I can finally get his coin. Okay, Mystery Goomba, take that. Huh? Get back here. Stop running away. Oh my god, just stay still. That's it. Now I'm gonna... Huh? What is this? A force field? I didn't know you could do that. There's a lot about me you don't know. What? You can talk? Yes, and now I think it's time I give you a little lecture of my own. As you know, there are 77 Goombas in the game. I am one of them. Now, while I've been stuck on the death barrier for the last 30 years, all the other Goombas have gotten to roam around freely. But that does come with a cost. Since they're out in the open, you and other players have killed them millions of times. And every time a Goomba is killed, the game then generates a new Goomba for the next player, causing the cycle to repeat. So over the years, every Goomba has been constantly getting killed and replaced. All of them but me. I'm the only one who's been around since the beginning, silently observing, seeing all the destruction and devastation you've caused to Goombas. And now that I'm free, you're gonna pay. What did I ever do? Really? We don't even need to go back that far. We can just look at what you've done over the past 2 hours. You forced that one Goomba to run around you forever. This isn't even a flashback. This is live video feed of him still going even now. Ow! You trapped that one Goomba on a sign. I let him off of there. What, so it's okay to do a bad thing to someone if it's only for a limited time? Well, ow! You brought a Goomba to the King Bob-omb fight. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. And then you killed him and said you wouldn't forget his sacrifice. Uh-oh. Ow! You made that one huge Goomba think he was regular sized. Okay, that didn't hurt him. And then you killed him. Well, okay, you got me there. Ow! You crammed all those Goombas into a cage. What? That was for the Goomba Jamboree. They enjoyed that. And then you slaughtered them all. Ow! You put down dozens of Goomba clones just so you could bounce up to the secrets. But that one looks so cool. Ow! Now, I could finish you off right here, but I have a better idea. Let's see how you like being stranded on the death barrier for 30 years. What's that thing you always say? Oh yeah, take this. Thanks to the support of my members, I was able to make it back, giving me one more shot at killing the Mystery Goomba. Okay, Mystery Goomba, let's have one more go. No tricks, no lectures, just me and you, one last showdown. He jumped. This is my chance. I'll do a slide kick to hit him on the way down. Oh no, a double jump. He knows all of my moves, but maybe I know one of his. By the way, Mystery Goomba, it's not take this, it's take that! But how did you know where I would be without even looking? It was simple. Goombas always turn to the right when you go directly behind them. No! The Mystery Goomba's coin! The most sacred coin in the game. Now I can finally collect it. No, it never fell down and became tangible. I was so close. I was so close.